collaborative webinar on pandemic, migration, and politics of life, jointly organized by Vidyasagar University and Calcutta Research Group. We are happy that Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Vidyasagar University, the inaugurator and the keynote speaker of the webinar, is present among us. A very warm welcome and regards to you, sir. We are also happy that Professor Shomir Kumar Das, Department of Political Science, Calcutta University, who was formerly the Honorable Vice Chancellor of North Bengal University, and who is presently the Honorary Director of Calcutta Research Group, is with us too. Thank you, Professor Das, for coming and joining. And I take this opportunity to propose the name of Professor Shomir Kumar Das as the chairman of the inaugural session.
I firmly support and attest to this proposal.
Thank you, Debashish. Thank you, Debashish, as Debashish Bandyopadhyay, Professor Debashish Bandyopadhyay has seconded it. Welcome, Professor Das. But before Professor Das assumes his responsibility as the chairman of this webinar, a word or two about the webinar. You know, friends, we are through an unprecedented time in human history. And one may describe it with an analogy of a storm as penned by the Japanese writer Murakami. And I'm quoting Murakami, let me quote. And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain, when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That is what this storm's all about. This is from Kafka on the Shore. Indeed, the COVID-19 has wreaked such a havoc that all of us are affected. Our existence is shaken at the roots, but perhaps the most affected are the migrant workers and the people who work in distant places and who after losing their jobs were forced to go back to their places of origin, but could reach there only by paying a heavy price of their lives. In such a situation, as the members of social science community, we cannot sit idle in our safe cocoons. Hence this seminar, in which we would like to address the issue historically and also from the points of social and human sciences. The webinar also has a workshop mode inbuilt in it. It is about teaching or studying migration as a part of the syllabus. Here it will be, and I'm rather proudly I'm mentioning it, that the political science department of this university, with constant encouragement from our Honorable Vice Chancellor, who leads us from the front, and he knows it, that we have introduced two years ago a core course within the in the PG syllabus. It is course number 205. Anybody can see it. It's about modern state and its challenges. And this course includes topics like forced migration, refugees, internal displacement, climatic refugees, the role of the UN bodies like especially UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, etc. And we hope that after this webinar, our faculties, students and research will take more interest in this study. With these words, now may I request now Professor Das, Professor Shomir Kumar Das, to say a few words about the significance of this collaboration. Professor Das, please.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Honorable Vice Chancellor, friends and colleagues from Vidyasagar University, from the sister academic institutions, dear students and participants. On behalf of Calcutta Research Group, I extend a very hearty and warm welcome to all of you. We feel deeply honored for being able to collaborate with an esteemed institution like Vidyasagar University. In fact, when I sent my request for collaboration to the Honorable Vice Chancellor and for delivering the keynote address, he readily agreed. We remain grateful to him and his university. Some of you may not have known our institution. What began as a small collective of like-minded scholar activists in the late 1980s has by now grown into a vibrant research initiative and a hub of scholars engaged in exploring policy alternatives and making policy advocacy. While CRG's work revolves around issues of forced migration, our concern with forced migration studies has led us to branch out into such fields of knowledge as democracy, autonomy, governance, peace and justice, human rights, social media, public and civil society dialogues, and so forth. One of our main objectives is to generate and disseminate policy relevant knowledge, not so much by replicating what most of the conventional academic institutions do, but by cutting new areas and experimenting with newer modes of doing research. CRG is part of the collaboration comes under our program on migration and forced migration studies, being supported by Institute of Human Sciences, IWM Vienna. The program mandates us to organize public lectures and webinars, workshops for media persons, host international scholars and media fellows, bring out publications and disseminate knowledge through other innovative digital and audiovisual methods, translations into local and regional languages, besides holding interactive workshops with college and university teachers like this. 3 of our recently held webinars with college and university teachers organized in collaboration with 2 premier colleges of West Bengal and with a Delhi University College and Delhi University itself have been immensely popular. This is the 4th in the series in the current calendar year. As we participate in these events, we have the following objectives in mind. A, framing a syllabus on forced migration studies. B, working for inclusion of forced migration studies as part of the existing social science, liberal arts, humanities syllabus. And it's heartening to learn that Vidyasagar University has already included a part of forced migration studies in its course structure. C, sensitizing particularly young members of the faculty to the importance of generation and dissemination of policy relevant knowledge in the field. D, exploring the possibilities of turning the workshops into a prelude to a longer certificate course with 108 contract hours to be hosted at CRG and creating a durable platform of teachers and researchers engaged in the field. Before I conclude, I once again welcome you and hope you will enjoy the webinar. Like all of you, I too look forward to hearing the keynote lecture to be delivered by the Honorable Vice Chancellor and attending the brilliant sessions and participating in exciting interactions that Shivaji and his colleagues have organized for us. I thank Honorable Vice Chancellor, Shivaji and other colleagues of Vidyasagar University for their advice, help and kind cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dash, for this introduction, and especially the role of CRG and the present project of IWM. And as we have said that under the stewardship of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, we are new vistas are opening in our university, and this course, that is modern state and its challenges, which we have included in this syllabus. Thank you so much. And now may I request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, to formally inaugurate the international webinar. Sir, please.
I would like to congratulate the organizers for organizing a seminar, a conference, a webinar on a subject like this. It's very well timed. We all are in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of a pandemic. And this webinar is going to discuss migration, issues like migration, pandemic, and politics. It's a very good initiative, and I congratulate Professor Shomir Kumar Dash, the director of CRG, and Professor Shivaji Pratim Vasu and his colleagues, and also all my esteemed colleagues in the CRG and Vidyasagar University for taking this commendable initiative. And it's my formal duty, as I have been requested by Professor Shomir Kumar Dash, to inaugurate the conference, the collaborative conference, the digital conference, as the Vice Chancellor of the university. So I formally inaugurate it, and I wish it all success. I hope there will be very lively discussions, very fruitful discussions, and we all look forward to it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You, with
Thank
these
you. Thank you, sir.
with these kind words, the Vice Chancellor has inaugurated the webinar. So we are now moving into the proceedings. I would now request Professor Ranjan Chakraborty to deliver the keynote address. I do not think he needs any introduction, but for some of us, it's important that we introduce some aspects of his very illustrious curriculum vitae. Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Vidyasagar University, is an outstanding historian and especially well known worldwide as a historian of environment. He has taught at the departments of history, Vishwabharati, and later Jadavpur University, where he served the department for more than 2 decades. During his long teaching and research career, he received Senior Fulbright Visiting Postdoctoral Fellowship at Brown University, USA, the prestigious Charles Wallace Fellowship at the Suez School of Oriental and African Studies, UL, University of London, and was awarded Alexander O. Vieta Memorial Fellowship at Brown University. He was a member of the International Preparatory and Program Committees of the World Congress of Environmental History, held in Copenhagen, Denmark in August 2009. He has been twice awarded the Alfred Bell Fellowship, 2007 and 2009, at the Forest History Society, USA, to work on deforestation and wildlife in colonial, post-colonial India. Professor Chakraborty either taught or lectured at Brown University, London University, Roskilde University, Denmark, Center of South Asian Studies, Suez, London, Australian National University in Canberra, Sydney University of Technology, West Virginia University, Rachel Carson Center, Munich, the German Historical Institute, Paris and Washington, DC, Academia Sinica, Taiwan, and other institutions in India and abroad. He had a large number of research articles and books. Some of his notable works include Does Environmental History Matter? Picard, Subsistence, Sustenance, and the Sciences, 2014, Terror, Crime and Punishment, Order and Disorder in Early Colonial Bengal. It's a co-authored book published in 2014, Situating Environmental History in 2007, Random Notes on Modern Indian History, 1757 to 1947, 2014, 2 volumes of very successful textbooks on modern Indian and world history. He has co-edited Natural Resources, Sustainability and Humanity, a Comprehensive View in 2014, and very recently edited and a much acclaimed volume, Critical Themes in Environmental History of India. So it's over to Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Dash, for your very generous introduction. At the outset, I would like to again congratulate the organizers for organizing this collaborative conference. It's very commendable initiative in more ways than one, because at present we are going through a crisis, and we are in the midst of a pandemic, and so this is the right time to talk about pandemic. Let me tell you frankly that I have no expertise in pandemic or migration studies, or for that matter, politics. I don't know which way this webinar is going to go eventually. I was trained as a historian, so I can only offer you some historical perspectives. I have some interest in pandemics because you all know that uh, viruses and bacteria are all parts of nature, and I have some interest in the natural world, natural history, or environmental history. And I'm sorry to say that I am not a good choice as a keynote speaker. But I agreed for mainly for three reasons why I accepted this offer. You know, I'm the vice chancellor of the university, so I am here to promote my university. I want to academically promote my university, and I supported this initiative to organize this collaborative conference with CRG. And secondly, it was very difficult for me to turn down the request of Professor Shomir Kumar Dash, who is a very good friend of mine, and also the request of Professor Shivaji Pratim Basu, a very good friend of mine. And thirdly, you know, I have deep respect for Professor Ranabir Shamadar. He unknowingly acted as a mentor to many of us, to many scholars of my generation. I believe even Professor Shomir Kumar Das or Professor Sabyasachi Bosu Rai Chaudhary, to myself and many others. So it is also to show respect to Professor Ranabir Shamadar, whom I consider as one of my mentors. These are the three reasons why I agreed to deliver the keynote lecture. And thank you very much for inviting me. I take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to CRG and also to the organizers at Vidyasagar University. So we are in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a storm, and we are not very sure when this storm would come to an end. And when the storm recedes, what kind of a society and what kind of a political order it would eventually leave behind. We can speculate, we can discuss, we can use our objective senses, we can use our reason to understand the pandemic, and we can also try to speculate what is going to happen in the future. I was telling you that I was trained as a historian, but at present I do a different kind of history. You know, historians usually see history in terms of politics and ideology, and not usually in terms of biology, ecology, or culture. Usually this is the case. And so you see, what is a pandemic? Pandemic has its origin in nature because a pandemic can be caused either by a specific bacteria or by a specific virus. So these viruses and bacteria are parts of the natural world. So for a better understanding of the pandemic, we may consider political equations, the change, transformation in the political order, in the state mechanism. We can talk about power. We can talk about panopticism, the type of panopticon we saw in Wuhan, China, or the possibility of the rise of such social control in the future in the pretext of care, healthcare, and control of epidemic or pandemic. Alfred Crosby, the author of The Columbian Exchange, Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492. This is a book first published in 1972. It chronicles a development that transformed global ecology forever. the transatlantic movements of plants and animals and humans. You know, the years, the decades that followed the voyage of Christopher Columbus to the New World saw human migration, one of the largest human migrations in history. There was a great influx of people from Europe to the Americas. But it was not only a human migration, and Alfred Crosby was the first scholar to focus on other associated migrations. He talked about the plants, the insects, and the animals who went to the new continent along with the humans. And it led to a kind of an ecological transformation of the planet. It was a permanent transformation, and it shaped the future in many, many ways. Europe started transporting to the New World wheat, oats, and different types of fruits. And from the New World, we find they brought to the European continent maize, potatoes, and beans. But they were also importing and exporting animals. From Europe, horses, pigs, and cattle, goats would go to the New World. And there was also presumably exchanges of bacteria and viruses. As a result, the continents on opposite sides of the Atlantic, which were so different, yet they began to become biologically and ecologically alike as a result of the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus and his men. The old world diseases found its way into the Americas. A syphilis-like disease existed in Europe, but Crosby argued that venereal syphilis was carried to Europe by Columbus and his sailors. The Europeans, Africans, and Asians had no resistance or immunity to these diseases. Similarly, new viruses causing fevers and smallpox penetrated into the Americas and ravaged the continent. The American Indians had zero immunity against these new diseases. The death rate among them was very high, and they died in millions. So my focus would be pandemic, and I would try to historicize pandemic. I shall talk about, let me give you my lecture plan for a better understanding, better reception of the talk. I shall be talking about three pandemics. You know, there's a difference between pandemic and an epidemic. Let us first clarify this. You know, the definition of an epidemic is very simple. Epidemic means an outbreak of disease that spreads quickly and affects many individuals at the same time. Epidemic, it may be confined to a particular continent. It may be confined to a particular nation state after the emergence of nation state. So epidemic is smaller in size, in magnitude than a pandemic. Apart from epidemic, we also use another word, endemic. Endemic is something which, if a particular disease is found in a particular area, malaria, for example, in Asia and other tropical countries of the world, for example, is said to be endemic to tropical climate, malaria. So that is endemic. What is a pandemic? A pandemic has to be transnational. And before the emergence of nation states, it has to be transcontinental. It should occur worldwide, or at least it should ravage 2 or 3 continents. It should cross international boundaries and usually affect a large number, a massive number of people. Now, the context of this webinar, I presume, is the pandemic, is the ongoing pandemic. And my lecture this morning, the context of my lecture is, of course, the ongoing pandemic. You know, history is essentially a dialogue between the past and the present. So as a historian, I'm trying to open a dialogue with the past, and I focus primarily on three pandemics. They were pandemics, not epidemics. One is the pandemic that swept over ancient Greece in the 5th century BC, in the summer of 430 BC. I call it a pandemic simply because it touched upon three continents: Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe. The second important pandemic, on which I shall talk about 5 minutes, I shall talk 5 minutes on each of these pandemics. The second pandemic is the Black Death, which affected Europe, large areas of Europe in the 14th century. It hit Europe in 1347 and it ravaged different places of Europe. And the third pandemic is the Spanish flu. It affected a number of continents. Asia was badly affected. It affected Europe. It also hit the United States. So, and finally, we shall come to a kind of a dialogue. What kind of a lesson we can take from these three pandemics in the historical perspective? So I opened the talk with a quotation. This is the quotation from the diary, from the personal diary of one of my colleagues who lived in the Vidyasagar University campus during the entire lockdown from late March to July. I'm quoting, I quote, "It was a hot, sultry day of May 2020. A black and white Dalmatian with a leather collar round his neck was seen roaming in the Vidyasagar University campus. The poor dog had a very laughing face. The dog was terribly sick and there were wounds at different places of his body. The dog was understandably disowned by his master. The ill-fated, helpless animal was crying, groaning with pain. It was a terrible sight, and one would feel very sad. I guided the dog to our cycle stand and provided some rags to lie upon. The dog obliged, but it refused to drink water or eat any food. The next morning, when I went to the cycle stand to see the dog, I found it lying dead. In good times, his master would have surely provided the support it needed to survive." Unquote. I decided to mention the sad plight of this dog because this is not the only dog. Thousands of dogs were disowned by their masters and let loose, and most of them died. Many voluntary organizations in Kolkata, and I also saw them working day and night in Midnapur, some clubs, para clubs, they would cook food for these dogs because they were running out of food. And the same thing was happening to the humans throughout the country. A sudden lockdown was thrust upon India in the last leg of the month of March 2020. And the migrant workers, they caught the attention of the journalists. We could see how painful their experience was. They were trying to reach their villages, native villages. They were walking through the national highways with their children, with their thirsty and hungry children in the scorching heat of the summer months, and also sometimes torrential rain. So this is the broader picture. This is to understand the broader picture of a pandemic or an epidemic. Because if you think of an epidemic, if you think of a pandemic, the image that will come to your mind is that of the patient, the doctor, the dead bodies, the health centers, the hospitals, the disease itself, the physicians, the way they treat their patients, the body of the patient, the dead bodies piling up in the burial grounds and in the burning ghats. So this is the narrower picture, narrower image of the pandemic. In a broader sense, however, a pandemic means various things. It means the disruption of the entire society. It means the collapse of the old world. It means the rise of new social relations. It means insecurity, lawlessness. It means looting, economic depression, scarcity, black marketing, migration, new social alignments, rise of new power centers, rise of new power centers. And it, of course, means a problem of governance. There are historians, well-known historians who have worked on epidemic and also pandemics. To mention a few of them, Professor David Arnold, Dr. Ira Klein, Professor Mark Harrison, Professor Deepak Kumar, Dr. Vishwamoy Poti, Professor Aurobindo Samanto, Dr. Poonam Bala, and there are many others. The historiography on health and medicine and epidemic, it is enlarging very fast. Now, much of Bengal Delta, as we all know, was alternately inhabited and deserted through the ages. Many of such desertions occurred due to the outbreak of epidemic diseases like cholera or smallpox. Bengal was a place where we find the occurrence of many epidemic diseases. Tuberculosis was not an epidemic disease in the true sense of the term, but smallpox was. And malaria was endemic. And plague epidemic also devastated Bengal many a times. Now, Bengal, the earliest recorded history of a devastating epidemic dates back to the 1770s. Bengal was actually hit by a famine in 1770. Contemporary popular literature, ballads, and folk songs are packed with the description of the famine. There is a graphic account of the famine in Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel Anandamot. The famine was one of the greatest calamities in human history. It is known as Chiattorer Monnantar. It was accompanied by epidemic diseases like cholera and smallpox. The mortality rate was very high, and in many cases, the entire village was wiped out by such epidemics like cholera or smallpox. According to official estimate, 1/3 of the population of Bengal was wiped out by this famine. O'Malley estimated that the number of villages declined from 6,000 in 1755 to 4,500 in 1771. Now, in the Western perception of India, you have certain stereotypes. We can see certain stereotypes. If you ask your European or American friend that what comes to your mind when you think about India, some will reply that, well, when I think about India, the image of elephant comes to my mind. Some will say tigers. So these are the stereotypes. When they think about India, they will see the image of elephants, tigers, jungle, wild jungle, poverty, starvation, famine, slums, and of course, epidemics. Some may say that, well, when I think about India, I see the image of Taj Mahal. But epidemic disease is always associated with India. I shall return to this point later on. I'm now turning to the first pandemic that I propose to discuss. This is the pandemic. I call it a pandemic. I again explain why I call it a pandemic. This is the first recorded pandemic in history because it touched upon at least 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. This is the pandemic that broke out in Greece in the 5th century BC. To be more precise, in the summer of 430 BC, it affected Athens. and it affected Athens during the time of a war, during the time of a civil war. A civil war was going on between Sparta and Athens. This war is known in history as the Peloponnesian War. And we have a graphic description of this pandemic, of the plague epidemic, what Thucydides calls plague epidemic, in the book titled History of the Peloponnesian War, authored by the ancient Greek historian Thucydides. And Thucydides said that the plague killed nearly a third of the Athenian population in the summer of 430 and caused greater loss of human life than the rest of the war. A mass grave was discovered in 1994, and this grave illustrates, the archaeologists say, the terrible death rate. The disease, it is described as plague, but interestingly, it was not actually a plague epidemic. Any epidemic, any infectious disease which would spread very quickly and in which there will be very high mortality rate would be invariably described as plague, because in the ancient times there was no technology to identify the viruses or bacteria, so any epidemic would be invariably described as plague. Because with plague, humans had more familiarity. Plague is a very prehistoric disease. We have traces of plague even in the in 8000 BC. So it's one of the oldest identifiable diseases among the human societies everywhere. So whenever there was any such epidemic, any such disease, deadly disease, which would lead to death, would be described as plague, and Thucydides also described it as plague. But after the excavation in some of these mass graves, the archaeologists and the biologists, they tested the dental remains of the dead bodies, and they confirmed that it was not actually a plague epidemic, but it was actually a typhoid fever. It was typhus, not plague. But this is a recent discovery in the year 1994. But this disease actually, even if it was a typhoid fever, actually traveled from Asia, some parts of Asia. It came to Ethiopia, it reached Egypt, and it touched upon Libya and finally entered Greece. And the death rate skyrocketed because Pericles, the ruler of Athens, he forced the Athenians to move into the walled city and locked them. So as a result of this close proximity of so many people, density of people inside the city-state of Athens, the death rate multiplied very quickly because they did not have access to pure drinking water. And in Thucydides, in the book authored by Thucydides, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, we have a graphic description of the disease, the symptoms of the disease. I'm just quoting one sentence from Thucydides. The symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness. Even people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent hits in the head, and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural breath. And there will be very much pain in the chest. The pain would reach the chest and it would produce hard cough. When it fixed in the stomach, it upset it, and discharges of bile of every kind, named by physicians, ensued. Pericles was the ruler of Athens, was infected, and he did not survive. Thucydides, the historian who left behind this graphic account of the so-called plague epidemic, he survived the epidemic. He survived the disease. Now, interestingly, there is no evidence of the presence of the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis is the bacteria that triggers off plague. Rather, we have evidences of Salmonella enterica cerovotyphi, that is typhus fever. So, so biologists have proved that it was not actually a plague epidemic, but it was a typhus fever. What is striking, we have to keep two things in mind. It occurred in the midst of a war. The war was a civil war, but it was a war between Sparta and Athens. Sparta was located in the Peloponnesus, the area, the region of Greece where Sparta was located was called Peloponnesus, and the city-state of Athens was located in Attica. So it was actually a civil war between the people of Attica and the Peloponnesus, and the war was known as the Peloponnesian War. What happens during a war is that movement increases. The ships would sail through the waters, and the Aegean, it would cruise through the waters of the Mediterranean. And what happened, the disease could spread very fast in the harbor areas. And the disease first surfaced in the most important harbor of Athens, Piraeus. So war was a very important factor. This pandemic broke out in the midst of a civil war, and Athens had a very good navy. It had good fast-moving sailing ships, and Athenian ships would sail to Persia, to Africa, and the disease spread very quickly, and it turned into a pandemic. The second important pandemic that I propose to discuss is the Black Death, which swept over Europe in 1347, 1351. It was a plague epidemic, and it has been proved beyond doubt by the biologists that it was a plague epidemic, and it came to be known as Black Death, and it killed about 100 million people, 80 to 100 million people, and it is the gravest epidemic in recorded history. It's a worst case scenario for an epidemic, deadliest pandemic in history in terms of the total number of deaths. It killed about 1/3 of the population of whole of Europe. It infected 70 to 80% of the people of Europe, and the total death would be somewhere around 80 million to 100 million. Now, it first surfaced in a seaport in Sicily, and here also you find two important things. One is war. It came in the wake of the Crusades. You know, the Crusades, it was a religious war between the Christians and the Muslims. The Christians wanted to recover some of their lost lands in the Middle East. And the war went on for centuries. The first crusade started in the 11th century, and thereafter it continued up to the end of the 13th century. So the crusade increased the movement of ships. The ships were used for strengthening the naval activities, and the trade route was also the overland trade route. The Silk Route in particular was another factor behind this epidemic. It is believed that plague first began in Central Asia and spread to Europe through vast trade routes such as the Silk Road. The historians studying the spread of the plague discovered that the disease was spread by fleas that are commonly found on rodents such as rats and mice. Rat was identified as a major factor behind the spread of the disease, and as such, it is now understood that the plague spread via trade routes as the rodents traveled in caravans and on merchant ships. The first case was detected when a Genoese merchant ship arrived in Sicily. The merchants on the ship were suffering from the effects of the plague, which included flu-like symptoms, There were black and painful lumps that oozed blood and pus, and the patients were seen vomiting. The traders had just returned, these traders had just returned from a port city on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. While there, they had encountered Mongol raiders, which they supposedly received the disease from. Therefore, Silk Road led to the spread of the plague because it allowed the infected rats to easily travel vast distances and come into contact with all sorts of new population or people. The merchandise, the goods were picked up from different places of the Silk Road. They were loaded in ships, and the crew became infected in due course. And when they landed in Europe, they brought the disease along with them. So this is one of the deadliest epidemics in history, and we again find two common factors. One is the movement of people due to the war, the Crusades, which went on for centuries, and also the commercial activities of the Italian merchants. Sicily was the first initially affected area. Finally, I come to the last pandemic that I propose to discuss. This is the Spanish flu. I did not know that the Spanish flu or flu epidemic adversely affected India. I thought that it mainly affected Europe and America, the United States. But as I was going through the American Historical Review of 1918, I suddenly discovered that the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, scheduled to be held in Cleveland, Ohio, it could not be held in December 1918. It was scheduled to be held in the year 1918 in the month of December. It was cancelled. The American Historical Review, published in 1919, recorded that it was cancelled, and according to the editorial, it was cancelled because of the epidemic of influenza. In the last 4 months of 1918, the Spanish flu, as it was called, killed more than 3,000 people in Cleveland, where this conference was supposed to be held. It killed nearly 2,000 in the entire state of Ohio, and it killed 500,000 people in the whole of the United States and about 20 million people in the world. So I was aware from the American Historical Review about the magnitude of the epidemic, influenza epidemic in the United States, but I did not know much about. I knew that it affected parts of Asia, but did not have any idea how much it affected India. The 1918 influenza pandemic was the most severe pandemic in recent history. It was caused by an H1N1 virus with genes of avian origin. Although there is not universal consensus regarding where the virus originated, it did not originate in Spain, although it came to be known as Spanish flu because the Spanish media was the first to report the occurrence of this epidemic. Because Spain did not participate in the First World War, and therefore the Spanish media was free from the censorship. It spread worldwide. It occurred in the United States. In the United States, it was first identified in military personnel in spring 1918. Among the military personnel in the army cantonments, it was first identified. It is estimated that about 500 million, or 1/3 of the world's population, became infected with this virus. And mortality rate was very high. Mortality rate was something between 4% and 5%. And 50 million people, the estimated death was about 50 million people. And out of 50 million people, about 12 million people died in India alone. In India, the 1918-19 influenza pandemic cost at least 12 million lives, more than in any other country. It caused widespread suffering and disrupted the economy and infrastructure. Yet, despite this, and in contrast to the growing literature on
মেশিনে দিয়ে দাও, এখন কথা বলো না।
recovering the forgotten pandemic in other countries, remarkably little was recorded about the epidemic in India at the time or has appeared in the subsequent historiography. An absence of visual evidence is indicative of a more general paucity of contemporary material and first-hand testimony. If you Google, if you Google, if you search for images of the Spanish flu, you will find plenty of images, innumerable images relating to the occurrence of the flu in the Euro-American world, but not a single image from India. This is very strange. The death rate was highest in India. Compared to other countries, we find that there was more deaths in India. The impact of the 1918-19 influenza epidemic on India was devastating. Upwards of 12 million people and possibly as many as 18 million died from influenza or from pneumonia and respiratory complications. The mortality was equivalent to 4-5% of the population, as recorded in the decennial census of 1921 census. If we compare 1911 census with 1921 census, we find that the death rate was about 4-5% in India. And again, you find in the case of this pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, again you have the presence of the role of the ships. It was thought to have begun with the arrival of infected troop ships in Bombay and Karachi in the months of May and June 1918. And again, you have the war. This time it was the First World War. In the wake of the First World War, this pandemic of influenza spread rapidly. There was movement of people, movement of soldiers. Indians were recruited as soldiers and they were taken to distant lands. They fought wars on behalf of the British Empire in Africa, in different parts of Europe. And when they returned to India, they brought back the disease. I just give you one or two sentences from the report of Punjab's Sanitary Commissioner. He painted a very bleak picture. At the height of the crisis, this is from the month of mid-October and early November, when the pandemic was in a roaring form. The pandemic started in the month of April, May, and then it reached its zenith peak in the month of November. And I'm just quoting a few sentences. I'm quoting, quote, "The hospitals were choked so that it was impossible to remove the dead quickly enough to make room for the dying. The streets and lanes of the cities were littered with dead and dying people. The postal and telegraph services were completely disorganized. The train service continued, but at all the principal stations, dead and dying were being removed from the trains. The burning ghat, cremation site, and burial ground were literally swamped with corpses, whilst an even greater number awaited removal. The depleted medical service itself, sorely stricken by the epidemic, was incapable of dealing with more than a minute fraction of the sickness requiring attention. Nearly every household was lamenting a death, and everywhere terror and confusion reigned." Now, it was a devastating epidemic, but we have almost no record. It has become a forgotten epidemic, and very few records are available. And interestingly, very few historical works have been done on this pandemic, in which more than 12 million Indians died. We have graphic accounts of cholera and plague from the 19th century, and but not anything about this influenza. This is a question which will haunt the historians. One reason is that the British colonial rulers, they did not give much importance to this epidemic. and they could not gear up their medical infrastructure to respond to the needs of the people, because death rate was higher among the lower classes, among the weaker classes of the population. So they were not very much concerned. Although elites were infected, but their number is very small and most of them survived. It is said that Gandhi was infected, Mahatma Gandhi, but he quickly recovered. And this could be one reason. And they wanted to conceal their failure. The British colonial state was trying to conceal their failure, and they were trying to associate India with epidemics. It was the origin of this epidemic was not in India. The origin of the Spanish flu was in the Euro-American world, but they were always talking about that it was an Indian epidemic, because epidemic and India, they always go hand in hand. This was their perception. They stereotype the problem in such a way that, well, it is actually India's epidemic. India is the best laboratory for the epidemics, and that is exactly happening, and we have nothing to do. So they wash their hands off, and but it's a very you will be intrigued by this question. It will keep on haunting you, that how can 12 million people die and yet apparently leave so little trace. And historians, unfortunately, have not yet probed into this particular epidemic, the influenza epidemic. Uh, Barring one or two articles, there is a very long article by Professor David Arnold, published in the Transactions of the Royal Historical Society, London. There are not too many well-researched articles. Then there was a role of rumor during this pandemic of the influenza fever. There was a lot of rumors. People started calling it war flu because it originated from the First World War. Then it was also associated with the gas bomb used by the French during the First World War. They thought that the disease actually has emanated from this gas bomb used by the French in the First World War. Now, the result of the epidemic was hunger, poverty, and soaring prices. It really mattered. Harsh and worsening economic conditions aroused popular anger in ways not seen since the height of the plague years. Such an epidemic, where the rise in food prices, it was not even seen during the plague epidemic that occurred in the late 1890s. The most important point is that the government, the colonial government, did not take any lesson from this pandemic. For all the immensity of lives lost and the enormous suffering it occasioned, India's influenza epidemic did not seem even to contemporaries to convey any particular moral or political lesson, to be instructive to state, science, or society. For many Indians, to whatever class they belonged, influenza was part of a more engrossing struggle for survival, subsistence, and self determination. They did not care much. The suffering people, the weaker classes, they did not care, although they were asked to maintain social distance and they were asked to wear masks and wash their hands, because there was no medicine, there was no antibiotic during those days to contain the subsidiary bacterial infections which may result from viral infection. In 1918, paracetamol was not available in the market. Paracetamol was discovered, but it was not commercially marketed. It was not available. But aspirin was available. The only medicine uh, for this particular influenza was aspirin. Aspirin was available in 1918. Uh, and the laboring men, they deserted the places where the epidemic was in its worst form. They tried to reach the railway station. They gathered in large numbers to return to their villages. Such scenes were visible in the larger cities in Kolkata and Bombay. Uh, and uh, and the and the laborers, they wanted to return to their places, but they were not much bothered because they were already at the loser's end. They It was for them, it was a larger, it was part of a larger struggle for survival. They were not bothered about epidemic, they were not bothered about social distancing, because they wanted to have food and clothing. That was their primary concern. Now, coming to the conclusion, I will argue that uh, the lockdown suddenly imposed on India throughout the country in the last leg of the month of March without any preparations. Was it necessary? Was it really necessary uh, to force upon the lockdown on the entire nation without making adequate preparations for the migrant workers? We don't come across any lockdown during the 1918 influenza epidemic. No such circulars, government regulations in the colonial papers. I could not trace a single. There was no such thing as lockdown. People could move if they were able to move. Railway transport was available. Railways were operating. Roads were open. And we find that the workers, the laboring men, they could also go to their place of work if they wished. But sometimes there was panic and they wanted to flee for their life. In some cases, there are mixed responses. Now, the present pandemic, I would argue, the present pandemic, uh, the international scenario tells us to review the entire system once again. We have not taken enough lessons from the epidemics that occurred in history. Now, the present pandemic is indicative of a total failure of politics, capitalism, and science. We have uh, we have successfully carried on the smallpox zero campaign and the vaccination, but we are not very sure if there will be any vaccine for this particular COVID-19. This is a very big question. And the point I'm trying to make is that politics is universal and we have the pressure of international politics. We impose the lockdown because of international pressure, perhaps, because of the fear of, uh, because of the fear of infection, and because of the apprehension of a rising death rate. But this is a failure of international politics, and this is a failure of governmentality. This is a failure of science, because the science is helpless. We realized, suddenly we realized how fragile the sciences can be against viruses like this. And it's a failure of capitalism. And we can all understand that we are actually heading towards a new world order. After the storm subsides, the world will not be a similar place. This is a kind of a war. This is a kind of a war that politics, capitalism, and science are waging against this enemy, supposed enemy of virus. In the pretext of the virus, we are actually trying to impose our control, a new social control on the society. So this is a matter of grave concern. We don't know whether there will be a more autocratic mechanism in the future to control the society. This can be a real concern for all of us. Finally, to conclude, I will argue that this virus is a product of nature. So we have to understand nature more carefully. Humans have exerted a marked influence on earthly ecosystems. Cutting of trees or destruction of nature may contribute to the happiness of the humans, apparently. But the idea of progress implies an interventionist and aggressive management of nature, which may eventually turn out to be suicidal for the humans. The present pandemic has raised this question along with many others. As an environmental historian and an admirer of deep ecology, I will argue, and I will appeal to the humanity to listen to the voice of nature more carefully. Deep ecologists are not neo-Malthusianists. Rabindranath Tagore was a deep ecologist. He was not a neo-Malthusianist. Alexander von Humboldt was a deep ecologist, but he was not a supporter of, his ideas were never close to anything like neo-Malthusianism. Similarly, the environmentalists, they are talking about something to protect the entire planet. The viruses and bacteria, they are parts of the natural world. Perhaps we could have spared the smallpox virus. We should not have eradicated smallpox. We should allow smallpox to exist, because such viruses could have acted as a kind of a buffer against the creation and the invasion of this COVID-19 virus. This is a subject which the biologists will be better able to explain, but this is a new idea that is forthcoming among the leading biologists of the world. If there is diversity of viruses, if there is diversity of bacteria, then this diversity, this biodiversity itself is a kind of a protection, a defense against the rise of new viruses. So, like the deep ecologists, I would like to give a boarding call to the politicians. It's a boarding call to politics, capitalism, and science. That let us not thrust upon uh, panopticon for the sake of care, for the sake of care, for the sake of health, or for containing or for preventing the outbreak of epidemic, future epidemics. In the name of epidemics, we should not try to coerce the people, as Professor Ranabir Shomadar has argued in his edited anthology, Borders of an Epidemic, COVID-19 and Migrant Workers, published by CRG 2020. So I thank you all. Thank you very much for your patience. And apologies if I have taken more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. Like others, I must say that this is what happens when you listen to a historian of the stature of Professor Chakraborty. It's a sort of swimming across history from 430 BC to at least up to the early 20th century. We must be thankful to Professor Chakraborty. He has agreed to take a few questions. So I will read out the questions for him. We have about 3-4 questions which he might like to address. May I read out the first question? Despite witnessing several pandemics in world history, there is no law in our country to deal with the crisis. to deal with the current situation, the government of India invoking natural disaster laws. Sir, do you think that the concept of pandemic needs to be differentiated from the concept of environmental disaster? So, Professor Chakraborty, would you like to take the questions one after another, or would you like to address these questions in one go?
So kindly unmute your options. So kindly unmute.
I can take the questions together if you kindly allow me. I'm taking
Yes,
down.
yes, yes, of course. This will save time as well. Um, the other question is that it's a historiographical question. Why the contemporary Indian historians, many of them are stalwarts, remain silent about the massive effects of Spanish flu in India? So this was one of your questions. I guess you also have answered it.
Okay.
There is the other question. Would you consider, I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes, please.
Would you consider Crosby's notion of the Great Atlantic Exchange also refers to a negative influence of globalization in terms of the diseases it helped migrate? In other words, the connection between globalization and migration and its impact on the spread of the virus. There is a compliment. Thank you very much, sir, for beautiful analysis of the history of the pandemic. Perhaps we have not learned much from history. That's what defines the essence of his presentation. Daniel Defoe's The Journal of the Plague. The Journal of the Plague Year, based on the 1665 plague in London, refers to several migrant Dutch businessmen saving themselves through complex lockdown. Do you think it holds a message for today's pandemic in India? Now, this is a very important question because what I learned from your presentation is that during Spanish flu, there was hardly any lockdown. Then has this coronavirus epidemic initiated a war of the worlds? Is the war exposing the very basis of the civilizational differences? That is thinking. It comes from the YouTube streaming. Do you consider Crosby's notion of the Great Atlantic Exchange also refers? No, this is the same question being repeated here. I guess that this is, thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful deliberations. No, that's it. So in other words, I have listed out the questions for you. So please feel free to answer them to the extent it's possible for you to answer them, to the extent you consider them as relevant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for raising these questions. Very important questions. The first question was about whether an epidemic can be called an environmental disaster. Am I right?
Yes, you are right.
Of course. That is the point I was trying to make. When I opened with Alfred Crosby's book, The Columbian Exchange, I was trying to put it plain that a pandemic may have political implications. It may lead to polarization of the world, or even it can lead to questions regarding migration, politics of migration, the different sides of the argument regarding the necessity of imposing a lockdown. Apart from all this, an epidemic is certainly a manifestation of an environmental disaster. It is just like a cyclone, a super cyclone. It is the product of nature. It is the product of nature. The point I was trying to make at the end of my talk this morning was about the plausibility of going after the viruses which used to produce smallpox. You know, we led the smallpox eradication program that we did under the forceful impact of the Euro-American world. The West wanted that India should lead a campaign against smallpox and eradicate smallpox. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all the major South Asian countries became an integral part of this anti-smallpox campaign, the Zero Smallpox campaign, the technical name. But we could have spared the virus which used to cause smallpox. We could have contained it in a different way, because viruses and bacteria are parts of nature. They contribute to biodiversity of the natural world. Now, there can be a question on this statement. I may be asked that, well, then you are not bothered about the safety of the humans. No, that is not my argument. We could have worked hard on the discovery of a medicine, of a panacea, to contain smallpox instead of eradicating it completely from the natural world. Was it necessary? I mean, this question is coming up as a result of the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic today. And yes, I see this as a natural calamity, as a kind of an environmental crisis. We are debating regarding the role of the state, governmentality, the various ways of containing the pandemic, our faulty strategies. We are debating it, we are criticizing it. But we need a deeper philosophical analysis, introspection regarding our use and abuse of nature, which also might have contributed to the proliferation of this pandemic. The second question was, it's a very good question, the point I also raised, that why historians are silent about the epidemics, why they don't write on the epidemics. This is not true. You know, the historiography on health, medicine, epidemics, that is expanding very fast in recent times. In the Western world, in the Euro-American world, it was never neglected in the manner we neglected it. But there is a change for the better in recent times. For example, for the last 15 years, we find that the historiography of health, disease, medicine is expanding very fast. I told you about the American Historical Association. You know, there was such a major influenza epidemic which killed about 20,000 people in the state of Ohio. The conference of the American Historical Association was scheduled to be held in Cleveland, Ohio, and it could not be held because of the outbreak of the flu. It was cancelled, called off. But I checked all the subsequent numbers of the American Historical Review. I checked up to 1932-33, I believe. They are now available online. But when I consulted them, I had to read the hard copies in the libraries in the United States, in New York Public Library and Rockefeller Library. I was trying to find out if there are any articles on epidemic disease. I was very curious to know if the American Historical Association published any article on epidemics, health, medicine. But I was astonished to see that not a single article on history of health, medicine, or epidemics were published. Even after the outbreak of this epidemic, which disrupted their own annual conference. Certainly, historians neglected it. Historians thought that this is not their subject. Their subject is only to give grand narrative of the rise and fall of empires, grand narrative of war, military action, the history of dynasties, the great deeds of the kings and queens. To write, it was more popular to write about Ferdinand and Isabella, on Elizabeth. It was more popular, fashionable to write on how Elizabethan ships made history, how Elizabethan navy defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, rather than concentrating on the epidemics, on the health situation. Absolutely. But historians are now waking up. I can name a dozen scholars who are into this subject. We have our colleague in Vidyasagar University, a former Fulbright, Dr. Devjani Dash. She is working on history of medicine and health. She worked on the mental asylums in colonial Bengal. Then Professor David Arnold, he has worked on cholera and colonialism. He has written a full-length book. Then we have Professor Aurobindo Samanto, who published in 2018 the book titled Living with Epidemics in Colonial Bengal. So it's not true. I don't agree that even Professor Chittabrata Palit also published a full-length book on epidemics. So it's not true that historians are neglecting it anymore. They are working on it. We have very good centers where the best center in the world perhaps is located in the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. They are doing various works, in-depth research on history of health, medicine, epidemics. But it's not very popular because, you know, historians' interest actually emanate from the present society. History is a dialogue between the past and the present, but history begins in the present. It is from our present interest that we research on past events. Today, historians are showing more interest in epidemics because we are now in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of an epidemic. We did not, you know, don't blame the historians alone. Historians' interest is actually produced from the context of the entire society. Lenin was worshipped as a hero once upon a time, but after Glasnost and Perestroika, historians started depicting Lenin and Stalin as monsters. They were heroes, but now they, in the hands of the historians, they became monsters. So why it happened? It happens because the historian is a product of the present society. He takes a look at history from the present questions, from the present concerns. I believe that there will be more research on history of health and medicine after this pandemic. And what was the final question? I have, Mr. Chairman, sir, what was the final question?
This was on Crosby's book.
Yes.
And let me read it out here. Do you consider Crosby's notion of the Great Atlantic Exchange also refers to negative influence of globalization in terms of the diseases it helped migrate? In other words, traveling diseases are a product of globalization. If you could
Yes,
reflect on that.
yes, very good question. That was the point I was trying to make, but I did not mention it explicitly, but it was implicit in my argument that, you know, the movement of people, you know, in all the three epidemics we referred to, the epidemic that swept over Greece, the Black Death, and also in the case of the Spanish flu, we find movement of people due to war. War also creates some kind of a dialogue, cultural exchange of people, travel, and you have more movements of people. And that's why I mentioned sheep. Now we don't have sailing ships. We don't need, we fly. We fly. So that is also the flying ships. So I indicated the movement. I was trying to indicate the movement of people across the continents. There was a time when ships made history. Ships alone could make history. And all movements occurred mostly through the waterways, through the high seas. You can move from one continent to another in your sailing vessels. And they were the carriers of diseases. As we saw in the book authored by Alfred Crosby, The Columbian Exchange, how it opened up a new world, how the two continents on two sides of the Atlantic, they were very different biologically and ecologically, how they became similar in the course of 200, 300 years. Gradually, both the continents became ecologically and biologically similar. But one problem of, there was a question, coming back to the previous question, why historians are relatively silent on epidemics, on history of epidemics or history of health? Simply because, historians are more prone, they're more inclined to take a look at history from ideological and political perspectives. We are very, we always see history in terms of politics and ideology. We never think that history can be written from the point of view of biology and ecology. That's why we write hundreds of pages on the Battle of Plassey and Battle of Boxer. But we don't write or think about the natural world that surrounded the Battle of Plassey, in the midst of which the waterscape, the landscape, the natural world in the midst of which the Battle of Plassey was taking place. But there are exceptions, like historians like Alfred Crosby or Fernand Braudel. There were people, there were great philosophers like Alexander von Humboldt or Rabindranath Tagore, who had a different perception about humanity and history. So we have to think deeply instead of only talking about political changes and political structures and political control. Let us do a little bit of biology and biological history and ecological history. There is no harm in it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent keynote address. I'm sure that that actually sets the tenor of the two-day webinar and the discussions that will be held under its auspices. Personally, I have learned a lot, and I would say that I would conclude by way of referring to three takeaways from your lecture. The first is that your critique of meta-history and your emphasis on studying what I would describe, taking liberty from your presentation, granular history, history in grades, which would be constantly flagging that lurking danger that science poses to us. The capitalism poses to us, the failure of science that it characterizes. The second takeaway is this, that the emergent new world order. I perfectly agree with you when you say that the emergent new world order might signify the death of democracy, perhaps a little more decisively than what Fukuyama or Huntington, either of them, has anticipated long back. And my third takeaway is the diversity of viruses perhaps is the order of nature, and we must acknowledge it. The more we want to suppress them, the more they come back, take greater revenge, and their lethality increases to the extent that we tend to suppress them. So with these few words, I thank you once again. Thank the colleagues and friends of Vidyasagar University, the organizing team in particular, Shivaji and his colleagues for for organizing it in a very successful way. I think that well beginning is half done. I see that a well beginning has been made. So with these few words, I would now pass over the microphone to Sujoy for proposing the vote of thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shamir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the chair.
Now, sir, if the chair allows, I would say that your presentation was as excellent as ever. We have heard you, we hear you. So often we know your ideas, but there is a larger audience. And also, sir, I was interrupted many times this morning because of this low bandwidth. We are suffering, Shomir, in this campus. We have it is absolutely a Wi-Fi campus, Wi-Fi enabled campus, but now we are suffering. Anyway, I think it will be over. And but I, sir, I on behalf of the organizing team, I congratulate you. I for your very nice presentation, very thought-provoking too, and I think other participants from CRG and from other places who do not have this opportunity of having you heard so often, they have gained a lot. And now with these words, yes, the chair with permission from chair, because chair is also our Shomir, our dear friend Professor Dash. So may I request, Shomir has already requested Dr. Sujoy Ghosh to the HOD Political Science of Vidyasagar University to offer formal vote of thanks. And I also would request Professor Shomir Kumar Dash, who is chairing, to offer the formal vote of thanks on behalf of CRG. Thank you. First, Sujoy and Shomir for the inaugural session.
So may I leave? Is it over?
Sir, just a minute. No. No. The inaugural session will be over.
Dr. Sujoy Ghosh, you please propose your vote of thanks on behalf of Vidyasagar University. I have proposed my vote of thanks from the side of Calcutta Research Group.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
I just want to add, may I add one thing? We are very thankful to the chair, Professor Shomir Kumar Das. He has been able to sum up my lecture, very effectively and very. So I'm very thankful to him for summing up and offering his comments. And also one more point, one last clarification. I hope this was not neo-Malthusianism. I hope this, this environmentalism is not equivalent to neo-Malthusianism. This is
absolutely.
A note of
absolutely. You made it absolutely clear. Thank you very much for your generous words. Let's turn to Dr. Ghosh.
Sujoy, we cannot hear you. Sujoy.
Unmute yourself. Unmute.
Sujoy.
I think there is some kind of problem in his earphone. Actually, he is unmuted.
Thank you.
Now can you hear me now? Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Well, we all will agree that we are facing a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Yet life must continue, and we are privileged to have the CRG or Calcutta Research Group with our university for organizing an excellent two-day international teachers workshop, Pandemic, Migration and Politics of Life. CRG is a top-of-the-line research institution. It has done many human-centric research, particularly in the areas of pandemic, migration, poverty, and deprivation. I am thankful to Professor Shomir Kumar Das, the honorary director of CRG, for being with us and for conducting the session. I am also thankful to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, for his excellent leadership and encouragement to us for organizing this program. And I am also thankful to the organizing team, particularly those young students who have taken all the pains to bring us together. And from the Department of Political Science, I feel privileged that my department is part of this excellent program co-hosted by the Vidyasagar University and the Center and the Calcutta Research Group. Thank you very much. I now again hand over to Professor Somir Kumar Das, the chairman, to conclude that.
Now, with your thanks, the session now is concluded. Thank you very much. So it's over to the next session. We will be listening to some housekeeping announcement from the organizers.
Yes, Shati, please. Shati Lekha. Now comes Shati Lekha.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and a hearty welcome to all. After this enriching and illuminative inaugural program, we are now going to start our first business session of the day. The theme for this session is Pandemic, Migration and Governance. I invite Professor Debashish Bandyopadhyay from the Department of English of Vidyasagar University to chair this session. The speakers of this session are Professor Kaushiki Dasgupta, Vidyasagar Chair, Professor, Department of History, Vidyasagar University, Professor Somir Kumar Das, Department of Political Science, Calcutta University, Professor Manish Kumar Jha, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and Professor Shivaji Pratim Basu, Department of Political Science, Vidyasagar University. One important point that we would like to mention here is that the duration of this entire session is 1 hour 40 minutes. We request our speakers to adhere to this allotted time slot. Sir, Professor Bandyopadhyay, over to you.
Thank you, Shati Lekha. So after the exemplary speech of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, who has set the ball rolling and at the same time contextualized today's entire conference, we now come to the first business session. As Shati Lekha had pointed out, we have 4 speakers. Before coming to the four speakers, let me make some particular notes, especially and exclusively for this session. When the COVID-19 virus hit the country, poor migrant laborers were caught unawares, not because they had contacted the disease, but because of a sudden panicked response of the government at the center. By serving only 4 hours notice, a country-wide lockdown was planned. The employers of the poor migrant workers in the cities, especially in the capital cities, closed down their businesses and retrenched their employees. The precarity of these people who live on daily wages suddenly became visible. Questions were raised whether a wise and sympathetic consideration on the part of the state could have saved scores of people and poor abject laborers from the gruesome hardship they were pitchforked into. The government appears to have no count of the many who died like lambs under duress or on the railway tracks. It seems to show how the state can prove itself to be indifferent and completely unaccountable to its poor subjects, or they could not have done anything more meaningful. The panelists of today's first business session will reflect upon different aspects of this absurd situation, from the social poverty, problems of migrancy, social governance, politics, and gender trouble. Due to paucity of time, I would like our speakers to limit their talks to 20 minutes each, please. To begin with, we have our first speaker, Professor Manish Kumar Jha, Professor of Political Science, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He is going to speak on migrants in the pandemic, politics of precarity and invisibility. So over to Professor Manish Kumar Jha. Professor Jha.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all, Vidyasagar University, Calcutta Research Group, for having me here for this discussion. and I thank the chair, the way the tone has been set for the present discussion amongst the panelists. I was listening to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, and I would like to start by saying and sharing with you that I am sitting at a place which has been the center of pandemic and epidemic in the country. So Mumbai, as you know, whether we talk of plague, whether we talk of influenza, or we talk of the present pandemic, more than 25% of the case load is from this state, and the city of Mumbai is one of the worst affected. Now, why I am setting this context before moving ahead to talk about the theme which I want to elaborate upon. I basically would like to discuss on migrants in the pandemic from the point of view of politics of precarity and invisibility. The idea of precarity and invisibility is something which we need to look at, that recently you must have realized that in the parliamentary deliberation, the government says that we do not have any data of how many people died, and therefore there is no question of compensation. So this very thing, that there is no data and therefore no question of compensation, tells us something about the nature of precarity of migrant laborers about whom we will be talking. Precarity, as we know, that it is a term which has been used. It's like pushing and talking about the ways in which people, the precarity is a situation where which is contingent, related to exact situation or of people in the situation where their precarious existence, lacking job security, and material and psychological welfare is it in a complicated situation. So when we say that we talk about politics of precarity and invisibility, we are seeing that how this is being ensured by denial of data, manipulation of data, and the way the migrant workers have been treated historically. So we live in a society that significantly values media as spectacle, and we know that we have experienced that spectacle and a spread of disease, risk of contagion, and the plight of migrant laborers, which was 6 months today, as we are talking, we are meeting here to deliberate upon some of these things. You would recall that it is exactly the 6 months back when this nationwide lockdown was announced, and the kind of a spectacle which we all saw. So when we look at those visuals, some which generated pity and sometimes it generated charity. However, it's also tells us that it was construed perpetually as migrant labor, as troublemakers and possible virus spreaders. So the discourse, while at one level, the spectacle of misery, the spectacle of problem, the spectacle of traveling migrants haunted us, at another level, there was a parallel discourse happening. So even if we look at and move beyond the binary of sympathy and hostility, we observe that these representation brings forth a complex dialectic of migrant visibility, invisibility, and state societal concern and unconcern. Now, what does it tell us about the location of migrant and the way politics is being played out? Many of us are familiar with the work of Italian philosopher Agamben, and some of you would recall, apart from his earlier work on state of exception and homosexual and other things, that you would recall that when the outbreak of this pandemic happened and Italy was at the throes of the problem, some of his writings were extremely provocative for a whole range of people, and people actually pounced at him. So he basically, what did he say? He said that this crisis wrought by this pandemic would be used as a justification to normalize exceptional power. What is that exceptional power? Not always in the context of this exceptional power has to be understood from the point of view of a fascist or a Nazism kind of feeling, or in the camp situation, or in this exceptional power, as we know, has been used either by using certain provisions of Disaster Management Act or a whole range of law and order mechanism which was put in place was used. We know how Parliament has recently, in a way, from the time, by the time 2 to 3 months of the crisis got over, or the crisis was continuing, we realized that many state governments started talking out about making migrant laborers work hour 12 hours. We all are familiar how difficult historical trajectory has been to make 8 hours work became norm in the society. So this push for controlling migrant labor who were anyway precarious, and I'm not going to the historical facts and factuals of the trajectory of their precarity, but we need to look at that how this exceptionality was used not only by the state and even by the market, the state market nexus. How did they try to deploy this exception, using this exceptionality? So in this enforced national lockdown and localized enforcement through sealing, containment zones, and sanitization drives, people are resigning themselves to compromise with their rights and in the name of biological life. So it was put it across that in order to take care of biological life, everything else needs to be suspended. And that suspension also, in a way, suspended politics for the time being. But as we know that the regime, through the use of exceptional power, tried to suspend certain kind of politics, oppositional politics, questioning politics, politics whereby migrants' concerns and plight can be highlighted, whereas for a whole range of other things, politics continued as usual. So the normal, regular politics of critique and challenging opponents absented itself from the public discourse, except from some small social media and other things. But politics can never be suspended, we also know that. So it put to rest, or it cannot be put to rest or confined permanently. So we do have a crisis of politics in the present moment. For the pandemic has exacerbated the disarray in political opposition, and its regime in power is taking decisions with little or no questioning. We don't have to go into the detail. Last 3 days, what has happened in the parliament, from farmers bill to labor code to everything, it speaks for itself that things which is concerning to migrant labor, the things which is concerning to organized sector, unorganized sector migrant labor, organized sector migrant labor, and agricultural labor, how that was pushed through by using a particular kind of regime figure and the kind of politics. So even when there is some amount of visibility of opposition, the government has willfully ignored it. We know from the FCRA norms amendment to PM Care Fund, everything tells us the reserved army of labor in a complete and permanent sense of insecurity. So while pandemic was created and presented to all of us in a particular manner. Now, when we look at some of these aspects, we also see that probably this was also used as an opportunity to control all kinds of life and the issues related to life and circumstances of migrant labor. So in a place where I am presently sitting, and in Mumbai, many of you are aware that while we know, and from the speech, from the talk of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, we also got to know about the history of pandemic. But what is that which makes a particular area, particular city, much more vulnerable to such a pandemic? And why is it that it is being organized in a particular manner? It is a received wisdom. We all know that whether it is Kolkata, whether it is Mumbai, these are the places where industry thrived. These are the places where labor concentration had happened. And these are the places we have a dense labor population. So in a situation where People talk about Dharavi model. People talk about, I must tell you and must share with you that one of the worst affected area, the slum locality in Mumbai is called Shivaji Nagar slum. And this Shivaji Nagar slum is basically, we have 85 to 90% population in this slum are Muslim population. And this slum, in fact, is an outcome of 1990s communal violence in the city of Mumbai. So now when you look at that, those organizations, those groups who work with migrant labor, who work in slum areas, how the present politics is suffocating and making it a point that they are not able to work with these groups. Present the classic case, last 2 days I have been talking and discussing with innumerable friends where whole range of community-based NGOs are completely anxious, disturbed that what FCRA amendment will do to them, because many of you might have realized that even the community workers' salary will become part of the administrative cost. Now, what does it tell? It tells us that first of all, the entire pandemic has been in a way subsequently used to further marginalize migrant labor, to make their life and circumstances complicated, and whatever little scope we have through civil society organization, through other, so that also being suffocated, constrained by putting in certain. So while at one level we see that the labor code and things like that complicates collectivization, coming together, the collective strength of the, whatever limited collective strength probably the migrant laborers could have thought of, that has been completely compromised. And at another level, whichever charity, support, community-based activities could happen through the community engagement with migrant labor. So there is a multi-pronged strategy which is being deployed so as to ensure that in a present neoliberal regime, this pandemic, which has started with the visibility of migrant on the road and traveling migrant in a big way and became a spectacle, subsequently that a spectacle was subsumed, the return migration started happening in a limited way, the migrants started coming back. We do not have time to go into the reason for that, but we know that gradually they started coming back to some of those cities, but their life is going to be much more precarious. Their life, their wages will have adverse impact. Their collectivization will have more complication. So it basically, and the other day I was hearing Professor Ranbir Samadar and something which struck to me, that this thing of looking at both migrant and the virus as an outsider, perpetual outsider. So this perpetual outsider is a psyche and is something which you deal with in a particular manner. So the framing of migrant, the examining of migrant, and then attending the migrant labor from a perspective, from an understanding which has extremely complex nature of governance that we all come to know. I would like to conclude by highlighting two aspects very clearly. One is that how do we see the nature and character of the state when we look at migrant? Anything of the nature of saying that we all know that ample data is available about who died, when they died, who got injured, how they got injured. But this nature and character of the state speaks volume about the way the pandemic subsequently has been used and in a way construed, whereby exploiting this as quote unquote opportunity to push through something which is in the interest of a limited corporate groups and at the cost of the poor, the marginalized, the vulnerable, and the precarious migrant population. So thank you all for giving me this opportunity. Thanks.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Monish Kumar Jha, for a very incisive commentary on the state-market nexus and how it creates an exceptionality during a biological crisis. The situation has been exploited in a deplorable manner by a new liberal regime to ride roughshod over the democratic rights and aspirations of the common people. With this observation, he has very pertinently raised and interrogated about the true nature and character of the state. With this particular question, with this interrogation, we will now move on to our next speaker, Professor Shomir Kumar Dash, Professor of Political Science, Calcutta University. He will speak on governing the pathological social governance in times of pandemic. Just to add, we will take all the questions at the end of the entire session. So over to Professor Dash. You have 20 minutes to speak. Sir.
Thank you, Chair. I would request you to sort of cut me short exactly at the end of the 20th minute. I will try to sort of compress the whole thing and communicate it within the time slot. Let me begin with a word of caution. It's still a work in progress. And it is in workshops like this that we get an opportunity of tossing around our uncut ideas and learn from our colleagues. So it is in that spirit that I humbly submit my thoughts. Please allow me to begin with an anecdote. And some of you may have heard me speak earlier as well. I cannot but begin with this anecdote. Just on the eve of the lockdown, one of my students proposed to work with me on manual scavenging and manual scavengers of one of the neighboring districts of Kolkata. Interestingly, an overwhelming majority of them has reportedly migrated from Bangladesh. As we probe this example a little more closely, we are confronted with a couple of paradoxes. First, if rule of law is considered as the textbook principle of the normal, quote unquote normal, that's how you define the normal. The very presence of this group of manual scavengers is emblematic of illegality, at least in three very different senses of the term. First, all manual scavengers that my student has been interacting with are Bangladeshis who had illegally migrated to the district town, apparently without carrying the necessary travel documents. Secondly, many of them confessed to him in confidence that they had criminal records in their home country. This is the primary reason why they had escaped to India. Thirdly, they are connected to a profession that was rendered illegal by the Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers and the Rehabilitation Act of 2013 that put an end to the practice. It is extremely unlikely that the police do not know of their illegal presence in the district town. Then why are they not nabbed, arrested, tried in a court of law, convicted, and punished if the rule of law is considered as the defining principle of what we consider as the normal condition of life in India? Since there is a demand for their labor, the policemen do not stop them from working as manual scavengers on the ground that people in these areas who are in need of their labor would be in distress. Notwithstanding the much touted Swachh Bharat Abhiyan or Clean India campaign, Kacha latrines are a stark reality, particularly in the older settlements of the town. The police think that they avert a public health disaster precisely by refraining from clamping down on them. In other words, what we understand as normal condition of life, and this is what is important, what we understand as normal condition of life can be maintained not by observing law, but by allowing this breach and violation of law. I note with great surprise that this breach or violation is essential for maintaining the normal. The limited scope of this presentation does not allow us to reflect on the problem of governing the normal, the essence of the first paradox. Our focus is more on the problem of governing the abnormal or the pathological. My student, and this is what takes me to the second paradox, my student also reported that way back in April 2020, the elbow of one of them was broken by the police when he came out to buy some essential items from a nearby grocer's shop, apparently breaking the strict nationwide lockdown that was still in force. Like thousands of others, he too was pushed into a situation when it was not possible for him to stay put in his dwelling place. According to a tele-survey conducted by Stranded Workers Action Network, SWAN, on a sample of 11,159 stranded workers about the same time, 50% of them had rations left for less than 1 day. Many of them had to come out to return home, either because they lost their jobs or because they were not paid their salaries for months. The survey tells us that 89% have not been paid by their employers at all during the lockdown. Another survey conducted by Azim Premji University tells us that 72% of the sample of workers simply lost their job in one single state of Karnataka. It is paradoxical, this is the second paradox, that if the police do not want to clamp down on them for averting what they describe as an inevitable public health disaster, then why in an abnormal situation they decide to push them back into the rat holes, even open fire on them, whether in Bandra or in Surat, and in 100 other unreported places, whether in a bus depot or in a railway station, wherever they assemble in thousands and try desperately to take the next vehicle to return home. This for us defines the second paradox. The theoretical cue of this argument draws on Georges Canguilhem, who cautioned us against taking the normal as the opposite of the pathological. For the normal calls for our ability to adapt to the fluctuations in the social environment, whether by bending or breaking norms, as we see in this example. The virus, however, introduces a radical change in the scenario, for it implies our reduced ability to adapt to the fluctuations in the environment. So, you know that we become increasingly sick. We are unable to cope with the environment, and that's why the disease breaks out. The disease demands that the law that separates the normal from the pathological, our normal uninfected bodies from the virus-carrying bodies, must be neither bent nor broken, but will have to be strictly enforced. We have to ensure that the virus is isolated and the deadly pathogen does not affect the normal. So those who are suspected to bear the virus in their bodies, the manual scavengers or the stranded workers, must not be allowed to come out and infect us. It becomes necessary at that precise point of pandemic to keep the normal separate from the pathological. Governing in this case, therefore, implies that the normal must be kept separate from the pathological in a way that serves all common or public good. For keeping the two separate is considered as a sine qua non of maintaining public health, at least in two senses of the term. First, public health is considered as indivisible. It is important to isolate every other member of my community and neighborhood from the virus so that my family and I stay safe. If my community is not safe, then obviously I am not safe. In other words, my family and I have a stake in the safety of my community. Secondly, one man's entitlement to safe health does not in any way diminish another man's entitlement to the same. They are not competing with each other, but are in fact complementary to each other. Take masking as an example. Masking is considered as one of the three principles of maintaining public health in times of pandemic, besides social distancing and hand sanitization, respectively. A team of my students recently conducted a survey on a sample of 100 respondents in order to figure out what they might think about the prescription of universal masking. About 18% do not know how important universal masking is in maintaining public health under the present conditions. To describe them as ignorant people. Roughly about 77% do not think that wearing masks like them will make any difference, though they grudgingly wear them out of compulsion. Because there is the police, for instance, who who force them to wear the mask. Why are they so much averse to the prescription? Interestingly, the arguments they offer shuttle between two extremes. One, wearing mask does not make any difference to one when one knows that everyone else in the society wears it. One chooses to be a free rider, enjoys all the benefits without sharing the cost, or rather the pain of wearing it. Sometimes the argument is exactly the reverse. And we are told if no one else is wearing it in the society, then it will not make any difference if one wears them. Pay the cost and bear the pain. It is like arguing that why should I suffer when no one else is bothered? In economic theory, this is called the public good dilemma. In other words, rules of sanitization, masking, and social distancing, in short, SMS, will not be ordinarily observed unless the state or the society compels us to do so. But where was the state to be seen? In other words, you know that in this context, I would say that there has been a retreat of the state on the one hand, and that makes social governance absolutely relevant. Early in the first morning of lockdown on 25 March 2020, when Barkha Dutt visited the interstate border of Delhi with Uttar Pradesh, she discovered thousands of stranded workers swarming around, desperate to return home, significantly without any trace of a policeman or state administration. For those desperate workers, the state simply withered away. The same Swan survey tells us 96% of the stranded workers had not received rations from the government, and 70% had not received any cooked food. The government, by its admission, does not have any record whatsoever of the number of the migrant workers. All of us know this. It happened just a week back. Or their deaths during the lockdown, whether in road and railway accidents, or due to starvation, fatigue, and overexhaustion, or otherwise, while undertaking their long journey, sometimes stretching over 1,000 kilometers. In simple terms, the exit of the state made social governance all the more necessary. The burden of migrant workers was imperceptibly thrust into the society, with the effect that governing the migrant workers under conditions of pandemic is now the responsibility of the society, not the state. This could happen, I will argue, wherever there is a strong sense of sociality. Sociality is defined as people's ability to associate with their home, household, neighborhood, or community. Wherever that is strong, that associativeness that is strong, and there is strong support system existing in the society. Now, I don't have time actually. The theoretical cue of this argument is drawn from Jacques Donzillo's work entitled The Policing of Families. All of us know that Donzillo was Foucault's student, and he became one of his colleagues in Collège de France afterwards. Social governance is possible wherever our association with the family, neighborhood, group, or community exists or is vibrant, and sociality is strong. Technologies of social governance are bound to be significantly different where the association is not as strong. I will just sort of compress the whole thing by way of citing just one example. We have examples in West Bengal, in Kolkata, of communities and neighborhoods erecting fences and barriers around themselves, all on their own. This was voluntary initiative, and refusing to let outsiders in. Fencing spirals through a series of perpetually shrinking concentric circles. Our concern for being safe continuously closes in on itself. If we cannot keep the neighborhood safe, then we need to keep our home safe. We have examples of infected neighbors being turned out of the locality and were seen to be wandering aimlessly till they were detected by the police or health workers. If we cannot keep our family safe, we need to keep ourselves safe. Again, we have examples of elderly persons turned out of their homes on the suspicion of having contracted the virus and running temperature in their bodies. I have all these chronicles, but for want of time, I cannot share them with you. But social technologies vary significantly in societies that are characterized by what we have called strong sociality. India's Northeast, by no means a homogeneous region, has so far recorded both lower rate of infection and fatality. When the minister in charge of the development of Northeastern region, M. Dona, prefers to attribute, quote, the success to the states of the region, unquote. Our study, on the other hand, shows how village vigilantism helped contain the spread of the disease. Even communities living in the remote areas enforce the lockdown independently of the mediation of the state. Spaces like treetops, floating boats, burning hearts, and crematoria were specially earmarked where the returnees could be accommodated. In Nagaland, quarantine centers have been set up just outside the village. In several places, churches have been converted into quarantine centers. In Mizoram, every day a batch of men from Champhai and Serchhip goes to the long and porous Myanmar and Bangladesh borders to keep out smugglers and gun runners. The residents fear these people might bring coronavirus with them. Such organizations as Naga Hoho in Nagaland and in the hills of Manipur, Neira Paibis in the Imphal Valley, Mizo Zilai Paul Young Mizo Association, or LLTF, which is a new organization, which stands for Local Level Task Force, formed in every locality in Mizoram. Mukti Sangho in Tripura played an important role in exercising surveillance, quarantining the outsiders, detecting and isolating the infected, helping the infected with medical care and medicine, and so forth. Our preliminary investigation suggests, now this is absolutely preliminary because I'm yet to finalize the conclusion, that in some cases such help and assistance cut across the ethnic boundaries. In the hills of Manipur, several villages produce vegetables locally and don't have to rely on external supply. When the people of Konshakul, a village in the hills of Kangpokpi district of Manipur in the plains, came to know that the villagers in the plains were suffering due to the shortage of vegetables, they, the Liangmai Nagas, started supplying vegetables to 9 villages in the plains. All these villages comprise the ethnic groups of the Kukis and the Meiteis, with whom their relationship had soured after the violence of the early 1990s. In other words, the otherwise conflicting communities develop a solidarity in the face of the pandemic. This is my last couple of sentences. As the neoliberal state stages a retreat and takes steps to arbitrate death, because whose death is essential today? The death of the stranded or migrant workers, or the death of the middle class elite? Life is governed by the groups, communities, neighborhoods, and villages. This is why social governance becomes the lifeline of the stranded and migrant workers. Social governance is about life, not death. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dash, for an illuminating talk. A very reflective empirical analysis of the conditions of the manual scavengers who have migrated to India illegally. As there is a demand for their labor, the government raises the refrains from taking any action on them. In spite of the cleanliness campaign like the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the non-normative phenomenon was allowed to perpetrate under a precarious condition. The talk raises a fundamental question about the nexus between the normative and the non-normative in a socio-political situation of the country today. This leads to us thinking about the true nature of the pathological. He also spoke about vigilantism, which has made the condition of the migrants complicated by colluding to criminal acts in the name of containing the pandemic. Thank you again, Professor Dash. Our next speaker is Professor Shibaji Pratim Basu, Professor of Political Science, Vidyasagar University, and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Commerce. He will speak about pandemic, community, and politics of life, reflections from Indian thought. So over to Professor Basu.
Thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyay, the chair, my fellow panelists here. This has been really a very, now it is going on a very, very engaging kind of webinar that we are having. We are thankful to CRG, especially to our Vice Chancellor. I will not speak much because we are already running behind the time. And I will not speak more than, I think, 15-16 minutes. And I will wait rather give space to some interactions, if possible. Not only on my paper, but also the papers of my fellow panelists. So let us begin with a difference in nomenclature. COVID-19 has not only wreaked havoc globally, it has also given birth to a few globally spread terminologies and renewed some old meanings. For example, words like social distancing, lockdown, containment, quarantine, isolation, etc., which have become the vocabulary of the so-called new normal. But a major change is about a prefix, pan, originating from the Greek, which means all, or of everything, or of involving all members of a group, which is placed before the adjective demic, which literally means characteristics of or pertaining to people or population. Together with the prefix, it comes as pandemic, which truly reflects the expanding and totalizing nature of the disease. And it describes the nature better than the prefix epi, which literally means upon or over something, which was previously used in epidemic. Thus, the disease that involves all members of a group, which can also be understood as community, also demands a resistance by the community. The recent responses to pandemic, by contrast, have hugely involved governments telling communities what to do, seemingly with minimal community input. So this is a global feature. This is a feature of India, and this is also the global feature. Yet communities, including vulnerable and marginalized groups, can identify solutions. They know what knowledge and rumors are circulating in the community, in the local areas. They can provide insight into stigma and structural barriers. And they are all well placed to work with others from their communities to deserve collective responses. Such community participation matters because unpopular measures risk low compliance. With communities on side, we are far more likely together to come up with innovative, tailored solutions that meet the full range of needs of our diverse populations, especially in India. In the present context, it would be beneficial to foreground some of the ideas and practices spearheaded by some of the stalwarts from India. And I begin with Tagore. In 1904, Tagore read his celebrated long essay. It's a very long essay called Swadeshi Samaj, which in English is translated as the native community, before a very large audience at Chaitanya Library Hall in North Kolkata. The immediate cause behind it had been the acute crisis of drinkable water in the rural Bengal and the reluctant attitude of the government to help the people or the society, and the people's deep anguish and anger over such reluctance. Soon the lecture was repeated in a second meeting, since many persons could not enter into the lecture theatre during the first time. The central message of the essay was that Bengalis and Indians should develop their self or inner strength. In Tagore's word, Atma Shakti or Atma Shakti in Bengali, than depend on the foreign rulers to fulfill their socio-economic cultural needs. Only this could provide the natives with the desired autonomy, material as well as spiritual, and free them from the humiliation of the foreign rule. This is certainly different than the current slogan of a very, very televised and very publicized slogan of Atmanirbhar Bharat, since Tagore's call was to evoke the inner strength of the community and non-dependence on the government as far as possible. Tagore began the essay with the differences between the Western British state and the Indian society. In our society, he wrote, the king was engaged in warfare, protection of his kingdom, and the business of adjudication. All the other tasks, from maintaining of education system to that of water system, had been performed by the society in such a manner that despite changes in the rule by different dynasties, which flooded our country through centuries, our basic nature, and he mentioned by nature here in Bengali, he wrote dharma. Dharma here we have to understand as nature, was not spoiled. Changes in rule did not spoil our society and make us vagabond, he writes. Our kingship was equivalent to what is known as the state or government in English, but there had been basic differences. Britain has vested all the welfare activities in the hands of the state, whereas India had only partially done so. In Britain, the state is based on the uninterrupted social consent. In our country, the state or the government or Sarkar Bahadur was nobody of the state. And I underline the word nobody of the state. It stood outside the society. Therefore, he argued, whatever we would expect from the state, we would achieve it at the expense of our freedom. Whatever task the society would entrust on the state, it would make itself unworthy regarding that field of activity. But such worthlessness had never been the characteristic feature of India. Yet, at the present moment, the poet lamented, the Indians were eager to hand over all the societal duties in the hands of the asocial, I underline asocial state. The government had already granted 50,000 in cash to solve the crisis of drinking water. It might even spend 50 lakhs in the face of a more intense movement. But what would be the ultimate result? The hearty initiative that once used to come from within the society would be transferred to the foreigners. Now this is Tagore. Tagore was in favor of society and this social inner strength, which will come, he thought, by this way. And it the commentators have compared this kind of notion of Tagore of Swadeshi Samaj with the Safa movement in Ireland. I'll not go into the detail, but just six years back from the time when Tagore was giving a call to evoke the inner strength of the community, Swami Vivekananda issued a plague manifesto in 1898 in the wake of the pandemic in Bengal. That manifesto, originally drafted by the Swami in Bengali and Hindi, was distributed to people for empowering them with basic information and values to boost their spirit and save themselves from that scourge. From that scourge. It asked people of Calcutta to fall back on Ramakrishna Mission at the time of crisis, posing danger to health, human and economic security. The manifesto appealed to the people, and I quote from the manifesto, "Brother, if there is no one to help you, then send information immediately to the servants of Sri Bhagavan Ramakrishna at Belur Math. There will be no dearth of help that is physically possible. By the grace of the Mother, monetary help will also be possible." The content of Swamiji's appeal was full of scientific and hygienic awareness as well as of spiritual courage. Come, let us give up this false fear and, having faith in the infinite compassion of God, gird our loins and enter the field of action. Let us live pure and clean lives. Disease, fear of an epidemic, etc., will vanish into thin air by His grace. Always keep the house and its premises, the rooms, clothes, bed, drain, etc. clean. Do not eat stale, spoiled food. Take fresh and nutritious food instead. A weak body is more susceptible to disease. Always keep the mind cheerful. Everyone will die once. Cowards suffer the pangs of death again and again, solely due to the fear of in their minds. Fear never leaves those who earn their livelihoods by unethical means or who cause harm to others. Therefore, at the time when we face the great fear of death, desist from all such behavior. During the period of epidemic, abstain from anger and from lust, even if you are householders. The manifesto says. The sensitivity and the humanity embodied in the words of the manifesto, which says that there will be no lack of effort in treating the afflicted patients in our hospital under our special care and supervision, paying full respect to religion, caste, and modesty, that is parda, of the women. This sensitivity would seem exemplary if we consider the kind of animosity which developed among the natives in Pune against the high-handedness of the British officials, almost at the same time engaged in strict imposing of health protocols associated with plague. On the contrary, as the plague in Calcutta or Kolkata claimed more lives and triggered panic among people, the Ramakrishna Mission set up a committee of which Sister Nivedita, Vivekananda's disciple, Western disciple, she came from Ireland, as you know, was its secretary. She moved in the streets of the city, distributed papers urging people to maintain cleanliness and hygiene, and got involved in many activities to prevent further spread of epidemic. She could be successful to a great extent by winning the confidence of the natives. The spirit of the inner strength, as put forward by Tagore, also found expression in the thought and deeds of Mahatma Gandhi. During Gandhiji's second to India from South Africa, he attended the Congress session in Kolkata or Calcutta to plead the cause of the ill-fated Indians in South Africa. The sanitary condition of the Congress camp was horrible. Some delegates used veranda or the balcony in front of their room as latrines. Others did not object to it. Gandhiji reacted immediately. When he spoke to the volunteers, they said, "This is not our job. This is a sweeper's job." Gandhi asked for a broom and cleaned the filth. He was then dressed in Western clothes. The volunteers were astonished, but none came forward to assist him. Years later, when Gandhi became the guiding star of the Indian National Congress, volunteers formed a Bhangi or sweeper squad in the Congress camps, where for once the Brahmins worked as Bhangis. 2,000 teachers and students were especially trained for doing the scavenging of the at the Haripura Congress. Gandhi could not think of having a set of people labeled as untouchables for cleaning filth and dirt. He wanted to abolish untouchability from India. Gandhi's group launched a mass contact program at the villages. And I quote from, this is from Tendulkar, Vijay Tendulkar. At the end of the morning's march, writes Tendulkar, a batch of men and women from his party visited the Harijan quarters of the village near the camp, taking with them brooms and spades. They talked about the necessity of sanitation, about keeping their yards clean, of burying rubbish instead of leaving it to blow here and there. While Gandhi was engaged in talks, people who had accompanied him would begin cleaning up the basti themselves. They highlighted the need to prevent the excrement lying in the open as it attracted flies and spread disease. We can recall also Tagore's 2 lines from Shohoj Path, that Aj Mongolbar Jongol Saf Koribar Din. So that was a kind of, it's a call, Tagore's call for his co-ashramites in Shantiniketan. What gains can we take from such salutary initiatives and thought, which taught us to fight any disaster together with the community, to foster a sense of unity on one hand and proclaim autonomy of the society from the omnipresent modern state? In many parts of the world, both in the West and non-West, we hear again the voices in favor of reviving the community bonds to fight against the novel coronavirus in the face of one-way governmental control. The Indian experiences are also not very bright in this respect. In a recent interview, I'll conclude very soon. In a recent interview, Ranavir Samadar, Indian social scientist, also reminded the importance of Jana Samavesh, that is mobilizing the community, as complementary mechanism to rebuild an effective public health system to fight COVID-19. Referring to the efforts of Tagore and Vivekananda, Samadar suggested that in Bengal, social groups, in a new spirit, social groups can be formed with the girls who receive the monthly stipend from Kanyasri, a scheme from West Bengal government to support the education of girl child from school to university. A few Kanyasri girls, according to Samadar argued, can be chosen from different localities and then trained in the basics of public health and hygiene. They can spread necessary awareness, monitor the information about the working of public distribution system, public health system in the locality, and give feedback to the government agencies. The local clubs and market associations can also be involved in this work. Finally, I'll conclude now. We may argue that mechanisms to ensure citizens' participation are essential for high quality, inclusive disaster response and preparedness. And these can be called upon in future emergencies. All societies have community groups, and that can co-create better pandemic response and health services, and politicians must be supported to incorporate these voices. Such public participation will reveal policy gaps and potential negative consequences of any response, and identify ways to address these together. Community participation holds the promise of reducing immediate damage from the COVID-19 pandemic and crucially of building future resilience. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Basu, for yet another very thought-provoking talk. You have begun with an etymological semantic analysis of the true idea and condition of what is known as quote unquote pandemic. He emphasized the need of a tailor-made, innovative ideas of controlling the untoward situation arising from the pandemic in the country today. He very contextually cites Rabindranath Tagore in order to problematize the present political agenda known as Atmanirbharata. He also refers to the example of Swami Vivekananda to underline the need for the right spirit of action required during such a pandemic situation. He reminded the audience about the philanthropic and the altruistic attitude required to tackle such a situation. He pointed out how Mahatma Gandhi showed the way of how to break the entrenched caste barriers in India by taking upon himself the performance of menial activities of a scavenger. And at the end, in such a context, he raised a fundamental question about the adequacy of the state's action during the pandemic today. Thank you, Professor Basu, once again. Our next speaker, last but not the least of this business session, is Professor Kaushiki Dasgupta, Vidyasagar Chair Professor of History of our own university, Vidyasagar University. She will speak on troubled lives, women in the shadow of the pandemic. So over to Professor Dasgupta.
Hello.
Yes, you can be heard.
Yeah, but I think the
You are
video is
audible.
not working. Yeah, I'm audible, but let me try. I think the video is not working. Just a moment.
Yeah, now it's working. Now it's working. I can see you.
Okay, it's working.
Yes.
It's working.
Yes. We can
Okay,
see.
but I can. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So very good afternoon to all the participants, our respected chair, my fellow panelists, and also my colleagues from Department of Political Science for providing me this wonderful opportunity to talk to you and to present my thoughts on the pandemic and the issues of women. And especially, I want to thank Professor Bosu. And because I'm from a different discipline, as you know, I am teaching history, and it's a completely, I'm not so much comfortable in these zones of migration, pandemic, or this such issues, but he actually encouraged me a lot to speak on this. So I have chosen a few issues just to share my thoughts. And the topic what I have chosen for today's discussion is troubled lives, women in the shadow of the pandemic. Now, the gender dimension of the pandemic, these are actually relatively new to the subject of discussion. And a variety of disciplines, including epidemiology, medical and biological sciences, social sciences, demography, they all contributed to the understanding of the pandemic in multiple ways. However, the women in general, they actually remained absent from the mainstream discussions for long. And gender has become a major conceptual tool for understanding the evolving pandemic globally. So it has provided actually a powerful way to see the structure of relation between men and women as central to various epidemics. And it added weight to our understanding of the infection as not simply as an individual experience of disease. Now, as we talk about the women's experience, let me first register here that there is no such histories available so far on the women's memoirs or the very writings on the very pandemic, particularly as a specialized subject or an area of discipline where women have actually exclusively they have contributed. But generally, this is actually falling within the broader category of women's history when we talk about the women's experience during the pandemic. And generally, there is a general concern that who are the women missing from history, and who are the women of achievement, and what did they achieve? And the resulting history of these notable women, this actually doesn't tell us much about those activities in which most women engaged, nor does it tell us about the significance of women's activities to society as a whole. So women of different classes, they have different historical experiences. And to comprehend the full complexity of society at a given stage of its development, it is essential to take account of such differences. And women also have a different experience with respect to her self-consciousness, depending on whether their work, their expression, their activity, it is male-defined or women-oriented. Now, in the first introductory inaugural session, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, he was very rightly mentioning one point that there is a dearth of history on epidemics and pandemics in general, and specifically when we talk about women, it's the situation is very much, I don't call it a kind of dreadful, but it's very much frustrating. And if we talk about the reflection of pandemic in history, in literature, in art, there are some, of course, there are some examples. There are some writings, definitely we can cite from literature, from general historical literature also. And particularly, I can recall the name of Virginia Woolf. I was going through his write-up. This was published, I think, in 1930 on being ill. And Virginia Woolf, the celebrated writer, she got affected by this pandemic. And another American writer, Catherine Anne Porter, when she was recalling the very understanding of Virginia Woolf on what she had written on the pandemic, that is the Spanish flu of 1819. So there is a very general concern that there is a very explanation that why the society in general, or why the historians in general, they had taken a kind of lackadaisical attitude impacted by the sense of trauma and fear. And the historians in general, they wanted to move forward. They wanted to celebrate the future, not the trauma of the past. So there is a general understanding that why the historians were taking a kind of very lackadaisical attitude. They were looking not so much interested in writing the history of pandemic. So there is a general understanding that they were trying to celebrate their life. They didn't want to look back. So this could be a very, simplistic understanding of the very historical dearth of literature. There is the historical lacuna that we are facing throughout the history of pandemics. Now, if we talk about the women in specific, there is the first question. If we deal about women, history, and pandemic in a very specific manner, the first question should be that is pandemic sex selective? Whether all these pandemics, now I think I don't have much time. I need to finish it within 20 minutes. So in the first part, I will just put up some points from history, from the very pandemics of history, that how did the women, they actually face the pandemic? What was their experience? And how did they encounter the very deadly diseases? And in the next half, I will just conclude with some recent issues and some arguments on migration, as we are talking about migration and some of the issues and concerns that we are facing during this time of COVID. And also, I think it will be continued thereafter. So what we can see that soon after the COVID-19 actually contagion, there is a spate of literature on pandemic. And there is a mentioning about women. How did they experience the pandemic? What was their lockdown diaries? How did they actually approach to their neighbors, their work pattern? How did it change? So these issues were being talked in general. But if you see that pandemics in general, it actually segregating orders. This actually completely devastated the very idea of space in general, that what was considered to be a space earlier, now these ideas have been completely changed. And when we talk about the fragmentation of space, the fragmentation of border, we also talk about the very new ideas that were coming in terms of our gender divisions in society. But at a broader gauge and when we talk about the gender divisions in society, we also talk about the mortality and morbidity issues. So how did the women, and particularly in terms of their lives and experiences, what was the situation in terms of mortality and morbidity? These two issues are becoming very much important when we talk about women as a part of the history of pandemic. Now, let me come to the point of Black Death. Now, if we talk about this Black Death of Europe, as you know, from 14th century, we can see that there are some, what we call them bioarchaeologists. These bioarchaeologists, they have argued, they have actually showed that the Black Death was also selective with regard to age and pre-plague health status, and also in terms of sex ratio. Now, there is a general confusion that whether women got affected more than their male counterparts when these bioarchaeologists, they were digging up the graves and they are putting up the skeletons, they are doing some sort of very meticulous researches that how did the skeletons look like. They are trying to investigate the bones, and somehow this historical discipline, this cross-disciplinary analysis and researches are becoming very much fruitful to analyze that what was the sex ratio, what was the mortality rate, what was the mortality ratio when we talk about the gender divisions in society throughout the history of pandemic. But there is a general problem in terms of determining the sex ratio, that there was no such population figure and census reports. These are available to us right now. Then it's not at all easy to determine that how many women throughout the course of the pandemics, actually when proper population figure, how did they behave, and what was the experiences, and what was the death rate, because demographic data was not available. Demographic data is not there. Population figures, census reports, and documented histories are not there. So it's not at all possible to have a very meta-narrative of the historical site of pandemic and women, particularly when we talk about the morbidity and mortality issue. Now, let me point out, there is one very wonderful research that has been coming up by George Moseng. He's the professor of epidemiology, and he also teaches history of plague in the University of Southeastern Norway. And he has looked for an interesting pattern for the spread of the plague pandemics during the Black Death. Now, he explains that the plague bacteria is transmitted to humans via fleas from white rodents. And during the Black Death, it particularly spread through the black rat, which eats grain and grain products. And it is more or less extinct nowadays in Europe. But as far as the available data is concerned, it is reported that women were most affected by the plague from 1600 onwards. Now, the black rat is one possible explanation why more women than men had the plague. Women stayed more inside the house than men, and rat actually lived in the houses and may have been given the plague onto women. And he says actually, and in addition, women held traditional caring function, which made them more vulnerable, more exposed to infection. And they had the main responsibility for the children and the elderly in the family. And their job was to care for those who were sick, those who were ill. So they were more exposed and they were more vulnerable to these infectious diseases. But after the plague, what we have seen, the very women's status is improved. And with so many men dead, women were allowed to own their own land, cultivate the business, and formerly run by their husband or son. And they had greater liberty in choosing their soulmate. And women joined guilds, ran shipping, textile business. They actually owned farmlands, although many of these rights would be diminished later because the aristocracy and the church, they actually tried to ascertain their former control, and women would still be better off after the plague than they were beforehand. So this debate has actually significant implications. And in terms of the history of Black Death, that what happened to women after Black Death, this is a very major issue which has been picked up by some historians, not in large numbers. And some of the women historians, they are also working on that subject, that how did the Black Death, whether it actually helped the women to regain the status in society, whether their status has actually shifted to a more better position, whether it was declined. So these issues are there. And I like to mention very important publication by Mavis Mate and her book, that is Daughter, Wives and Widows After the Black Death. This is a very important publication on women and Black Death called Daughters, Wives and Widows After the Black Death, Women in Sussex. And here, she, within the broader context of the debate, she talked about women's social position caused by the collapse in population, floating the Black Death. And she was asking that whether demographic decline accompanied by growing social and economic opportunities for women, or should historians, they emphasize the continuity of female work as low skill, low status, and low paid throughout the late medieval and early modern period. So these issues, these questions was raised, and when this Spanish flu struck, the influenza pandemic of 1918, it emerged. it also became a major concern for women's history. And there is a seminal work on the subject by Alfred Crosby's Epidemic and Peace, 1918, and it was published in America's Forgotten 10 Pandemics in 1989 with an enlarged, edition. And Woodbridge's Crosby, he actually talked about the very military arrangements and these other issues. But simultaneously, the historians of later generations, they pointed out that somehow Crosby actually missed the point of women and what was the position of women at that point of time, and how did they actually express their experiences. And if we talk about women in specific, we can see the very pattern of their victimhood, the very pattern they actually went into that zone of these infectious diseases by risking their lives. And these publications by other than this Crosby, there are two other publications. One is by Hogwarts Phillips and David Kingsley. They also talk about this 1918 influenza, but definitely it's a very poor historiographical harvest. And when we talk about the Indian experiences, as we were talking this thing, I think, in our last discussion, that why there is a dearth of literature of Spanish influenza, Spanish flu in India. And generally, I think that the British government at that point of time, they actually didn't show much interest in keeping the records. They didn't document actually the very statistics and data. And so the historians, somehow they didn't have the opportunity or the access to the documents they were looking for to project the history of Spanish influenza in India. And there is a book by Shashi Tharoor's British Raj I was going through, and there he mentioned that this Spanish flu, it was actually resulted from imperial misrule. And nobody in the government was particularly concerned about this 12 million deaths in 1918 and 19, because nobody in authority much cared. They actually had the political will, the administrative capacity, and the technical resource to do much about it. And although if you talk about the United States, males suffered more than female from the heightened death rates among the Spanish flu epidemic, if you talk about the Indian experience, it was a little bit different. Now, as a ship carrying Indian troops, they reached the shores of Bombay in 1918, and it remained anchored to the city's dock for about 48 hours. And 7 police sepoys, one of whom was posted in the docks, he was hospitalized of what appears to be influenza. And Bombay was soon crippled by the virus, and railway lines carried to different corners of the country. And there were other anomalies in the Indian experience with the Spanish flu. And India was the only country where more women died than men across all age groups. And it is hard to explain why did it happen, why that was the case. And the trend might have been due to the fact that women usually ate less well than men in the average Indian household. As the later gender discussion, they have prioritized in this case of malnutrition. So the women were more likely to be malnutritioned. Moreover, women were more likely to be treat the sick. And this Spanish flu and this thing, it actually hit women harder than men. And of course, the Spanish flu changed the society. If we talk about the positive issues also for women. And in 1919, we can see in England some security benefits. It was introduced for single mothers, for pregnant women, for widows. And the reason may have been the consequences that the Spanish flu had for women who lost their husband to the disease and were left behind with small children. And it has been studied that the Spanish flu, by going through diaries, letters, photographs, and other ethnographic and archival materials, this information nowadays we are getting. And the doctors, who were primarily men, they wanted to forget the Spanish flu altogether, but the nurses, those who were working in the borders, in the military fronts, the women, the caregivers actually, their history now has been reflected in some ways or other. And we can see that the flu pandemic in particular, there is another very interesting stream of analysis, what we call the idea of compassion, history, compassionate, providing care to the ill, to the sick. And by 1970s, there was 2 fundamental works by Richard Collier's Plague of the Spanish Lady and also again Alfred Crosby's Pandemic and Peace, 1976. These actually vividly described episodes of this compassion, because how did the women participate in caregiving process? This is another branch of history by women, for the women actually, and without nursing training. These women, they volunteered as nurse aides, as a healthcare provider. They organized community kitchens, and different states in America, in Ontario and also in Canada, they organized crash courses in nursing and entered the homes of the dying. And the US media, particularly the newspapers, they talked about group of middle-class women, those who knew how to drive and learned quickly to repair cars. They started ambulance services. The women started ambulance services, and they carried the dead bodies, they carried the sick, and driving through the war slums of the US cities. These young women, they rescued flu victims from garages, carrying dying men to women's ambulances. So these are the pictures which were published in different newspapers. Now, many caught the flu, but those who didn't die returned to their post and relation as a captain of women's motor crop. I can just want to quote something from that is by Catherine Richard. She was a charge of women's motor crop in New York City. She has written, "The influenza is nothing, though unless you let it develop into pneumonia, we never think of trying to avoid it."
Please conclude. Please conclude.
Yesterday, we had 6 calls to go to different addresses. We didn't wear masks. So these women, you know, what I'm trying to project here is actually long paper. I cannot, it's a bit difficult. So whatever my proposition is there, that throughout the history, we have seen several women, those who are participating in the pandemic in their own ways. Their lives were definitely troubled. They had their own class and caste experiences. They had their own regional experiences. And in India also, we know the stories of Savitribai Phule, who actually contributed her life for taking care of the Sikhs during the bubonic plague in Bombay. She actually died of that plague. She couldn't survive. And so these histories are scattered. How did the women participate? And of course, one of the deadliest pandemics in this century, that is the HIV pandemic, which actually more than 20% women are affected in South Africa by, and this is a very deadly disease and is spreading all over the world. And currently the situation is still now, it's very much dreadful and scary. So there is Ebola also, and side by side, these are the issues of historical social concern, and there are the issues of violence, the issues of unpaid job, the issues of migration. So these are separate issues, and women's history, women's experiences, these need to be separately identified, unless which we cannot have a very good and very comprehensive idea of how did the women tackle the pandemic throughout the course of history. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Professor Dasgupta, for cutting you short, but thank you anyway for your brilliant exposition on the relational structure between men and women of different classes and how it becomes visible to a reflective citizen during the pandemic. She refers to Virginia Woolf on being ill and the American author Amy Poehler to point out how women writers wanted to understand the complications of life, which, although not historical, but at the same time more perceptive in producing a sensibility towards such situations, which objective historical anecdotes do not successfully produce. She also pointed out the dearth of sufficient empirical data regarding the pandemic situations like the European Black Death to question the possibility of any meta-historical reflections on the historiographical patterns. Particularly conspicuous is the paucity of data about women's condition and role during the Black Death. Very, very significant. She also gave a summary account of the historical scholarship in this field. Thank you so much, Professor Dasgupta. Now, if you agree, we can quickly take up some questions. Let me see the chat box. Yes. Okay, this is a question for Professor Monish Kumar Jha. It says, sir, if we take the government version that it has the lack of data on the migrants, then can we say the state has any care to govern them? Then in your opinion, what is the way to govern them and bring them under power? So the state's inappropriacy of control and how it is inappropriate is something that has been asked in this question. So would you want to respond, Professor Jha?
Yes, surely. Very quickly. First of all, we all know that government loves management of population. And for managing the population, they have all kinds of data. So first of all, and we know in the public view, public imagination, or we have variety of data all over. So it is not the lack of data. It is not that the data has not been collected. It is that it is a denial of data availability, because denial of data availability also abdicates the state from the responsibility of compensation and factoring the fact that they have mismanaged the pandemic. So it is more in that sense rather than saying that there is no data. We all know that there is data. There are people who are able to provide data, and the state itself has data available with it. But it is denial of data to deny or abdicate its responsibility as a state, or accept the fact that they mismanaged the entire thing. So first of all that, and therefore this governance, there to me, there's no other solution will be temporarily making a state responsible through agitation, protest, mobilization, to me is the only way forward in the long run. All other effort, all other things can be temporary, it can solve some problem, but that's not going to be a durable solution. This is what I'm saying.
Thank you, Professor Jha. We quickly go on to the next question. We can return back to Jha later. This is for Professor Shomir Kumar Das. This is, sir, do you think that this measure of social distancing will leave an incurable mark on the community life across the whole world, and particularly in the caste-ridden Indian society known for practicing untouchability from time immemorial? Would you like to respond, sir?
Yes, thank you. I think the most important thing is this, that the social distancing, why is this phrase social distancing being constantly used? Because what we essentially mean is physical distancing. And it's a misnomer in that sense, but misnomer in the real sense of the term, because in a sense, you know, that this quote unquote distancing from the virus seems to have reinforced the pre-existing social divisions. In fact, a part of my paper deals with it, which I had to skip. Let me give you an example. Why did 300 nurses from Manipur had to leave sometime in early May from Calcutta? Precisely because, you know, that they were, and there is an organization called Manipuris in Kolkata, MIK. They have published a report, and the report says that they have been subjected to quote unquote racist attacks, hate speech. People started abusing them as corona, mistook them as Chinese, from where the virus has originated. The landlords decided not to rent houses to them, prevented them from using the elevators. The private hospitals, in fact, did not pay them the salaries. They were put under starvation. So the government of Manipur provided them with some of the buses, which took them to Manipur and then from there to Imphal, and then from there they moved over to the villages. In other words, what I mean to say is this, that this is a pandemic which calls for social distancing, quote unquote social distancing, but it has in the process reinforced the pre-existing social divisions. In this case, for instance, the racial divisions that exist in the Indian society. Mr. Chairman, sir, I have collected the questions for me. So would you allow me to continue so that I can actually respond to all these questions in one go?
Please.
Thank you. So the second question is the ASHA workers not being paid. I'm just sort of sequencing them to my advantage so that I can take I can actually club them together and try to respond them. Now the ASHA workers are not being paid and nobody cares for them precisely because you know that it has to do with the larger Malay. The public health care system has collapsed, not just in this country, but everywhere. So what is the consequence of the collapse of the public health system? The consequence of the collapse of the public health system is that those who can afford to buy medical care will have access to medical care. In other words, you will have to have money in order to have better COVID treatment. So you have this stigma, particularly in the Bengali middle class, that you won't like to go to the government hospitals. On the other hand, the collapse of the public health system is a universal phenomenon. The private healthcare system is based on a particular assumption. The assumption is that those of us who can afford to buy it will have access to it. In other words, we don't care whether others are dying in hospitals, whether others are remain uncared for long, deprived of medical treatment, medical care. We don't care. We don't care. In other words, this is what I try to emphasize when I say that this pandemic creates amongst ourselves a self-shrinking and perpetually shrinking concentric circle, in the sense that if our Honorable Prime Minister cares for the nation, we care for the neighborhood. And then if the neighborhood is unsafe, then we care for our home. Then even inside home, an old person gets infected, you turn him out of your home, and that person is required to fend for himself. We don't simply care. We are so obsessed with ourselves. In fact, this is what the US Surgeon General noted back in 2004 when SARS struck the country. It's very important. I mean, in his report, he says that public health system has collapsed, not simply physically, but in the cultural sense of the term, that we don't simply care whatever is happening beyond ourselves. I have one or two more questions. One is how has this reinforced the caste system, and what is the alternative? I don't really know the alternative. The alternative which is often being cited is this technology. So you have to have better technology so that that these people are not required to go into the gutter. That's exactly the phrase which someone has used. I have my trepidation precisely because that we have a law in 2013, and remember that this is also in response to another question, that there is nothing so easy like legislating an act. Pat comes the act. In 2013, for instance, you have the legislation which imposes a ban on manual scavenging. It doesn't criminalize the scavengers. It criminalizes the employment of scavengers in the act of scavenging. So it seeks to rehabilitate them. But what you see in reality, and that's what I began with, my anecdotal example, that in a district town where you have cultural latrines, so you require their service. And everybody knows it because they advertise themselves on the lamp posts with their cell numbers, with their cell phone numbers. So you can hire them. They're up there for hiring, for being hired. So everybody knows it. The police thinks that if they are prevented from doing this service, obviously it will lead to a public health disaster. So it, at one level, it shows the limit to the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. And on the other hand, it shows that life is as usual. In other words, you require the service of the scavengers. In fact, there is an estimate which was made in early 2020 before the lockdown started, more than 48,000 people, but less than 49,000 are employed in manual scavenging throughout India. So, you know that legislation is surely not the answer. I come to the last question, which is that does it reinforce the caste system? In fact, you know that I will not name the area where my student has been conducting his research for reasons best known to all of us. But if his universe is to be taken into account, then what we see is this, that most of these persons, not just most, but all of them are not coming from the traditional community of scavengers. The traditional caste of scavengers, which means what? That they are not into the occupation by virtue of their birth. Most of them, in fact, are Muslims, and they live cheek by jowl together, which means Hindus and Muslims live cheek by jowl together, which means what? Which means again that the imperative of occupation brings them together. In fact, I remember having read an essay which was read by Radha Kamal Mukherjee. It came out in American Anthropologist back in early 1950s. I forgot exactly which year it was published, where he argues that in India, in fact, occupation brings a variety of castes together. But that doesn't mean that there is no practice of untouchability. In fact, it means that while a variety of castes are brought together under the category of manual scavengers, they are also necessarily the victim of untouchability by the Babus and Bhadraloks in the society. I stop here. Thank you for your patient hearing, and thank you for the questions. Excellent questions, I must say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dash, once more. We here have yet another question directed at Professor Shibaji Pratim Basu. The audience wants to know the actual relationship between the roles that society and the state can perform in a condition which makes social distancing so imperative. And at the same time, how would religious dispensations like Ramakrishna Mission, especially underlining the word religious, can help in such a state of condition? One is social distancing. How would society help? The other is religious dispensations like Ramakrishna Mission. How can they work?
No, when I argued in favor of the involvement of the community, I never meant that the protocols, all the protocols should be, we should do away with all the protocols. Of course, there will be some medical protocols, but what I suggested, and inspired by Tagore and other stalwarts like Vivekananda, and forget about the religious connection, Mahatma Gandhi and all others, and also there are people in the West, in Africa, and other persons there. All of them are arguing, who are arguing in favor of evoking the society. That is, the society can, in fact, there should be a bridge. You know, you cannot, like as Tagore argued, India now India is not in the pre-British period, or in the Mughal Raj period, when the society enjoyed a kind of autonomy. that we cannot go back to that, but there can be a complementarity. Complementarity can be fostered, where the society society can hold on autonomy, because the society, the community knows better its members, the problems. Every community has its particularities. And you know, the government, when government addresses something, it is like allopathic medicine. It offers some, you know, wholesome kind of solution, which does not address the problems of all the most of the communities. So the communities, the people, if the people are active, if the people if the people are active, it may also help the government efforts. So government, I do not deny that in this day you cannot do away with all the government efforts, but there should be a complementarity and some place of the community, an important, very important place of community. And you know, policies should be formed in consultation with some of the community members, some of the active community members, some of the advanced kind of community members who are working for the community. So that is number one. And what was the second question? I did not write it down.
The religious dispensations like Ramakrishna Mission, underlying especially the usage of the word religious. What would be their role?
Okay. Then you know, most of the, you know, this is a kind of a mixture of, it was a mixture of charity, kind of a charity. We can, you know, the word mission. Swami Vivekananda used in fact, the suffix mission after Ramakrishna. Why mission? He wanted to keep the missionary, he wanted to evoke the missionary zeal among the sannyasis. So missionaries at that time, missionaries, you know, missionaries, the Roman Catholic missionaries especially, who were very much active in India, they were doing many, you know, these welfare activities. They you know, they continue their care works, you know. But that our Ramakrishna mission, you know, the sannyasis, our Indian kind of Hindu sannyasis, I mean, they were not much concerned about the community. They were only mostly concerned about their moksha. So not moksha, but Vivekananda said to serve the jiva, that is the human beings, as Shiva. So you should consider jiva as Shiva, and by serving the jiva, you are actually serving the Shiva. That is, you know, their point of view. So you know, in these days too, Ramakrishna Mission and, you know, Bharat Sevasram Sangha and other religious institutions are doing. So that is all. I'm not telling that the religious, forget about the religious connection, but see how they are doing their works. They are visiting the communities, they are visiting the local people and trying to build up something. So that is something parallel to the, and I think they are more effective to the state intervention, which rather very in an abstract way try to deal with the situation and often fail. They often fail. They state activities, they often. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bashu. This is a question directed to Professor Kaushiki Dasgupta. It says, I just sum up the question. It says that the ASHA workers had been, especially women, ASHA workers had been playing a veritable role during the pandemic and especially during the Atmanirbharata condition. But why does political shenanigans or political maneuverings don't make these particular people visible? Doesn't it really echo what you have been saying about the invisibility of the women workers during the European plague? Professor Dasgupta. Is Professor Dasgupta available? Is she online?
Hello.
Hello.
Visible? Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Yes.
Yeah.
Respond.
I listened. Yeah. The thing is that we cannot compare the situation of the ASHA workers as contemporary West Bengal with the medieval women from Black Death period, but definitely there is the invisibility question is there. But in terms of the ASHA workers, those who are working in the public health sector in the rural and grassroots level, they need much more, I think, more financial incentives and political and social incentives to make their work far more visible and adaptable to the society as a broader context. But in terms of their participation in the process, somehow I think the casteist and class questions, these should be also taken into consideration. When they are working, somehow they are lagging behind and they are not being properly identified or properly mentioned. And most of the news channels, somehow they are not paying any attention to the condition of the ASHA workers. And this is a situation everywhere we can see all over India, not only in India and abroad also. Those who are working at the grassroots, as we are talking about the scavengers, the public health workers, those who are working in remote villages, they are not getting sufficient amount of visibility, sufficient amount of incentive from the governments and also the non-government organizations. We are talking about the Ramakrishna Mission or that sort of charitable philanthropic organizations. They are also not getting that amount of visibility, that amount of incentive or funding, so that sort of recognition, what they should be given up. So I think we mustn't compare the question of visibility from medieval women to contemporary ASHA workers, but obviously the question of invisibility is very much there, and somehow these barriers of imagined and non-imagined, these are also very much existing till in 21st century.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Dashgupta. This is the last question that you would take. It is directed at Professor Jha, Manish Kumar Jha. It is pertinent, but at the same time, a very blatant political question. I don't know whether you would like to respond to this, but anyway, let me put the question like this, that during the pandemic, it shows that there had been a desperate political ploy or a design to throttle democratic rights. Now, is there any therapeutic, or better to say, a curative way in which this particular problem of destroying democracy can be tackled? Would you like to take this question?
Certainly, I would like to take. And
okay.
With the permission of the chair, one question which has gone up, I have also noted down that, so I will respond to that.
Yeah, sure.
So to respond to this question, to me, that in any pandemic or any disaster situation, when things don't work properly, in India, we have a history of regimes managing disaster well and regimes not being able to manage disasters well. And in that context, then certain regimes throttle democracy and throttle other things. I would be looking at what is going on right now. Situation looks very dark and scary, but to me, we have to have an element of optimism. Otherwise, we will be really cynical. And to me, we need to think the power and strength of collective mobilization, oppositional space, which can be reclaimed in due course of time, where some of these things can be altered, modified, responded to, which actually looks very, very difficult as of now. But to me, that we just cannot lose hope, and we think that it is possible, but a different kind of alignment, different kind of forging alliances between workers, farmers, oppositional space, probably that can be an idea. So it's just a hope, which I would like to say. Another pointers which will say that I mentioned that the pandemic has been created and presented to us, and please clarify this. So, I'm sorry if it looked like that I said that created. I didn't mean that it was created, but yes, the way it was presented to us. It was presented when I said, I meant that in this entire presentation of pandemic, it was more panic than the preparation. It was more law and order focused than public health perspective. It was more in terms of symbolism of and rhetoric of thali, clapping, Pushpa Varsa, and all those, and lighting the lamp and things like that, rather than a conscious and honest attempt to collaborate with provinces, states, bringing them into factor and the earlier imagination. So to me, it was presented as a panic. It was presented as knee-jerk reaction. It was presented as a police and law and order issue. That's where the presentation created havoc, and all wrong decisions were subsequently taken, and we are realizing that how it got a spread and what kind of complication it threw for us. So this is what I meant. I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jha. It has been such an intriguing discussion that I feel very pained to actually conclude this session. But anyway, there are other sessions to follow. So I bring this particular session to a conclusion, to an end, with another vote of thanks to Professor Jha, Professor Dash, Professor Basu, and Professor Dasgupta. So thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks to the chair.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
And over to Shatilekha for the next session. Shatilekha.
Unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Satil,
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, we are thankful to our esteemed chair, Professor Debashish Bandyopadhyay, and to our speakers, Professor Kaushiki Dasgupta, Professor Somir Kumar Das, Professor Manish Kumar Jha, and Professor Shivaji Pratim Basu for giving such interesting presentations. And however, it can be surely said that many of us felt that yours was a voice of sanity in the midst of an emotional, confusing and divisive time. We are now going for a short break, and we will meet again after 30 minutes to hear presentations by teachers and scholars. That session is to be chaired by our head of the department, Dr. Shujoy Ghosh, and the observer will be Dr. Surat Kumar Malik. And we will meet exactly after 30 minutes. Now it's about 2:30. We'll meet about 3 to 5 past 3. Sir, can I now conclude the session?
Yes, please, Shati. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. So we're meeting at 3 to listen to to listen to the paper presenters who are coming from the various colleges and who are also our research students. Some of our research students and other universities. Thank you so much.